Teresa Nightingale, and I am the Deputy Director of Pittsburgh Normal. Fake news was not a term that many people used 4 years ago, but it is now seen as one of the greatest threats to democracy, free debate, and the Western order. Many citizens are searching for certainty and control in uncertain times. However, that often means many are spurning democracy and being seduced by fake news and clickbait-type articles. We need look no further than the history of cannabis prohibition to see how easily a campaign of lies and falsehoods can sway public opinion and produce disastrous public policy. I am from Pennsylvania, birthplace of Harry Anslinger, who mastered the art of fake news by joining forces with William Randolph Hearst. Together, they terrified the nation and Congress about some dangerous new drug being brought into the country by scary, dark-skinned immigrants. The lone voice of reason from the American Medical Association was drowned out by the new reefer madness hysteria, courtesy of Hearst's fake news campaign propaganda. I would like to introduce the moderator for our first panel at this point, Fake News, the Role and Responsibilities of Journalists in Reversing the Narrative of the War on Drugs. Our moderator is Terrell Jermaine Starr. Terrell Jermaine Starr is a senior reporter at The Root. He has more than 5 years of journalism experience in public radio, television, magazines, and online reporting. He lived in Ukraine as a Fulbright Fellow, in Georgia as a Peace Corps volunteer. Starr has over 4 years of experience living in the former Soviet Union. He is currently writing a book proposal that analyzes U.S.-Russia relations from a Black perspective. We are honored to have him with us here today. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Terrell Jermaine Starr.
Okay, then. Okay, good. We're on. Excellent. So, first of all, this is the first panel. So, welcome everybody. Y'all feel good? Yeah. There we go. There we go. So, look, we're going to start this off and give everyone the chance to speak. And so, everyone will introduce themselves. And I've had an introduction already. And so, as you all know, I'm Terrell Jermaine Starr, senior reporter with The Root, and I am starting to write about the intersection of how marijuana can wean people off of opioid addictions, among other things, right? And so one key thing, we're gonna have about 15 minutes for Q&A, and some basic rules as you hear the speakers talk. Think about the questions that you would like to ask, simple rules. I know that everybody in here has some dope experiences, but it's about the panelists, and so we don't need to hear about your mixtapes. We don't need to hear about your own books. We don't need to hear about the concerts that you're kind of pushing on. We get it, you know. But when you ask a question, you know, the things that end with the question mark. Okay, so that's simply it. So I'll just start off. Right here. So everyone introduce themselves and with the question. What are some troubling trends in media have you all, you know, observed as a in the media throughout your lifetime and your work?
Sure. Hey, everybody. It's great to be back at this policy summit. I am the Social Justice Commissioner in Massachusetts. We have 5 commissioners that regulate legal marijuana, and our 5 areas of expertise are public safety, public health, government regulation, business, and social justice. So we make all of our decisions in public from those perspectives. Before that, for context, I spent about 15 years as an activist, and I had a law practice, and working with businesses to start cannabis businesses really showed me how difficult the licensing process was and how high the barriers to entry were. So that's where I focused my activism the past few years, and I started a firm with a focus on recruiting for the cannabis industry, with a focus on diversity. And now I basically look at how to make sure that the industry is fair, as diverse as possible. And we do that through a number of different ways, but primarily through our social equity program. So I guess I would answer the question by saying there is a lack of sophistication in the media around how these programs are being discussed. And it's becoming more apparent, I think, as Dr. Nademan mentioned, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Illinois, all of these states are making it a forefront of their legalization discussion as to how we can be fair to communities that were disproportionately harmed. And so in Massachusetts, we're trying different things. We tried giving priority in the licensing process to applicants who could show that they promote economic empowerment in those communities. We're also launching our social equity program, which provides technical assistance to applicants from those communities and fee waivers and other benefits. But what I find is that often in the media, it's just sort of oversimplified and summarized as Massachusetts is trying some things for people of color. They're trying some things for minorities. It's not going that well. And so when we are going through a painstaking process to be transparent, to talk about these programs, which in the case of the social equity program, we haven't even launched yet. We're trying to get people to apply. We're trying to get trainers to apply. That attitude and lack of sophistication is very difficult. And my hope is that as we start to do more programs in different states, that there'll be more detail and more understanding.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So Ethan, tell me your...
Yeah, I mean, about the media stuff, I said the point before that when media starts writing about how this stuff's been driven by the money, and that's how we got here, it's just not right. It's dishonest. It's like sort of projecting backward from what happened now. Here's the other issues. Media oftentimes uses the language pro-pot to talk about the marijuana law reform movement. But I know that many of my colleagues, my staff, the activists, the donors, the funders, all that sort of stuff are not pro-pot. They were anti-marijuana prohibition, anti the war on drugs. And so calling them pro-pot when some of us were, but many were not, it's in the ears of some, it's like calling the reproductive rights movement pro-abortion or something. And that just needs to stop and we need to call it out, right? The next thing is, when we won that California initiative in 2016, a couple of years ago, right? And it was big and all this sort of stuff. But, and you see, the media is understandably focused on the industry, because it is exciting and dynamic and new. But the thing that moves so many of us, literally the days and the week after we won, was we were getting reports back around California of judges and others just telling people who've been in jail for weeks or months on a marijuana charge, get out of here. We're not even going to wait for the law to take effect. Those cases of people getting their freedom because of the laws that we had passed, that was the thing that brought all of us to tears. And that included some of the folks, some of the pioneers in the industry folks, people like Aaron Smith or Troy Dayton and Steve D'Angelo are coming out of reform movement as well. The last point I just want to say about this as well is that, marijuana is getting legalized all over the place, but meanwhile, marijuana arrests have barely come down from 700,000 to 600,000. You got a state like New Jersey, which is on the verge of legalizing, but marijuana arrests have gone up in the last few years. There are still 600,000 people, still disproportionately young men of color getting busted for weed. There are still people losing their jobs for testing positive for weed when they're doing perfectly well on the job. There's still people, there's horrible things going on. The war on marijuana is going on and on and on and on and on, and I want to see media covering that story.
Right. One of the things that's an excellent point. And one of the things that I've learned about media is reporters are human beings, and we tend to cover people who we can get access to, right? And the industry is good because ultimately what you find is that so many people are, they go in, they lean on the industry because going to those people who are most marginalized in the neighborhoods, like, they're harder to access because a lot of times those communities don't trust the reporters, justifiably so, right? And so, Tanvi, just tell us about yourself and your work, and tell us some of the things that you see in the media coverage that is often, covered incorrectly.
Yeah, so the two of us are reporters, so this is incredibly, I'm learning a lot. I don't cover drug policy explicitly. I cover immigration and policing at a local level, which means that I cover drug policy. Because obviously the war on drugs and the narratives that have stemmed from it have really underpinned all the policies in these two arenas. And I think, just talk a little bit about myself. I work with The Atlantic and I work with City Lab specifically, which is our website about cities. And like I mentioned, some of my core beats are urban policy, how our cities are built, how they're being run right now, and also immigration policy, which, as we know, there's a lot happening on that front. I would just answer your question, Terrell, by saying, sort of reinforcing, I think, what my colleagues here just said, which is that when I'm, as a reporter, when I see what's out there, I feel like the narratives are really siloed. There's this whole new sort of wave of reporting on the industry, but there's not a lot of connecting the dots. Some of us are still working on giving the context for why we're here with respect to immigration, and why we're here with respect to criminal justice policy, and what's actually happening, and where the jail populations are increasing and where they're not increasing, and what's that going, what's that about? So some of us are trying to give that context, but I think there's not a lot of connecting the dots across those sort of different beats, I would say, almost, because they're not really different beats. At least they have major intersections that I think as an industry, as journalism has to sort of think about a little bit more. The second thing that I want to briefly mention, which I think about a lot, especially with respect to the war on drugs and the narrative around that and the narrative around immigration, is that I think about the limits of fact-checking sometimes, because there are some narratives that have so much play from such powerful parts of society that I have, in the past couple of years, been frustrated with our own abilities to keep trying to correct those narratives, at least in terms of facts, right? Because we've all seen facts are not always, well, they're not working right now. So I think the conclusion I've come to, and it's very imperfect, I would love to sort of hear from the other panelists about this, is offering a counter narrative and offering context, I feel like, is something that we can do as journalists, and have just laying that out maybe will make a little bit of a difference.
Good. Thank you so much, Tom. We appreciate that. And so, Dan, what's your take? And tell everyone who you are, of course.
Hey, so I'm Dan Adams. I'm a cannabis reporter at the Boston Globe. I used to get to say that I was the cannabis reporter at the Boston Globe. But there's actually three of us now who are on this full time, which is really an incredible and unusual investment by a mainstream outlet in people who are specifically focused on this topic. I think it's really important. Some of my fellow panelists brought up this idea of the narrative, and I'm sure that you've all noticed. Watching the media cover a particular subject sometimes can be like watching a bunch of kindergartners play soccer, where they just follow the ball all over the field and don't stay in position, right? And in other words, what they're sort of chasing the story of the day,
right?
And especially for reporters that don't cover it full time, they struggle to bring that context to bear.
Journalism is a hit it and quit it. Like, the function of it is very
we call it parachuting. Like, you sort of parachute in and out of something. And I used to be a general assignment guy, so I know that. I know that world well. I'm acutely aware of the role that an organization like the Globe plays in our media market. We really have an opportunity to kind of set the narrative, frankly. Other outlets look to us to sort of tell everybody what are we talking about? What's the conversation? Like, where's the focus going? And so I feel like it requires intentionality on our part. We've, for example, have covered equity a lot in Massachusetts, and we've done that by trying to share the microphone with a really broad diversity of people, getting out into those community spaces, like accessing those sources that are not going to send you a press release, or maybe even think to pick up the phone, or maybe not even want to welcome you in the room.
Right.
And it takes time, and it takes trust building, and it takes consistent, good, nuanced coverage that acknowledges, for example, that we are not just writing about a brand new industry, that this industry has actually been around for a long time. It's newly legal, but it's not new. And having those sort of nuanced points in stories helps build trust with those communities that may be reluctant to talk to us, because it's so important to bring their voices to the forefront. And so at the Globe, we've tried to be very intentional about whom we quote and include in stories, and make sure that, because we're the ones sort of telling everyone where to run, oftentimes, like where's the light shining? What are we where's the conversation going? That's not something that I want to do by accident. That's not something where we want to let our unconscious bias drive the bus, because a lot of other people are going to follow what we do. So we're acutely aware of that responsibility, and we try to wield it responsibly.
Well, thanks a lot. So I just want to set the stage for the next question, which is, how did this really crappy coverage start, right? And I just want to open up with my own experience. When I started to report, I was in graduate school, 26 years old, and I started off at the student newspaper. So just imagine, I'm 26 years old working with 18 and 19-year-olds. I was at the University of Illinois, so most of the students that were coming in, they were from the suburbs of Chicago. And I'll never forget the fact that there was a fight on campus at the Black Student Union, and 4 different law enforcement agencies came to investigate that fight. And on the front page of the student newspaper, it was about this fight, and it was a front page story for 3 straight days, a fight. Now, mind you, I'm at the University of Illinois that has the largest number of, sororities and fraternities in the country as far as their houses being on campus. And these white people do all the craziest shit that we can imagine, yet you don't see any of their crap splattered on the front page. And so I was the only Black reporter who was on, covering news. There were people covering entertainment, but it was new. But I was the first news person. And I knew when I was trying to get stories from the Black students, they wouldn't talk to me precisely because of that type of coverage, right? And so it starts young. All right, the coverage and the mentality of how you look at people and view people start young. And going into this next question of the 70s, in particular, the war on drugs, right? That terminology, the war on drugs. I just want to start off with Dan and then Ethan. I'm pretty sure you can talk about this. Is just talk about, how did this narrative start? How did the coverage really take root to tell the story as incorrectly as it has? So I'll start off with Dan. You can follow up with Ethan.
Well, books have been written on this subject, and I won't pretend to. I'm not going to take us through, going all the way back to the 1930s and that kind of propaganda. I do think people forget that in the 1970s there was actually a pretty strong decriminalization movement in this country. There were a number of states that actually passed laws in that genre. And there was actually a pretty respectful and nuanced public conversation about whether that was the right thing to do. And in fact, the Globe itself endorsed legalization in 1971, January 1971. We had 6 reporters spend months, maybe I think more than half a year, investigating the question of whether we ought to, continue to criminalize marijuana. And they used some really pioneering reporting techniques. They went out to California and put in public record requests, and they were able to see that 1/5 of all the criminal cases in California's court system were for simple marijuana possession. And so they started asking the question at that time, is this a good use of our resources? And after 6 months, they came to the conclusion that no, it wasn't. And so we had a front page, not an editorial, it was a reported story that concluded with a call for legalization. I think we and many other outlets really probably lost our way somewhat during the 80s. And it's an example of how powerful the narrative, once the narrative changes at the national level, once the government is sort of putting out this drumbeat of negative coverage.
Let's be real, they were focusing on Black people, right? I mean,
absolutely.
Like in my community where, people were selling, where the issue was taking place, it was Black people. So
that's right.
Yeah.
And this is why I kind of want to take it back to what I was saying about intentionality, because it's possible to write a lot of stories that in their individuality are accurate. Dan was arrested at, 123 Main Street with X amount of marijuana on this date. And that could be true. But if that's the only story that you ever write about marijuana, one after the other, after the other, after the other, you have to think about what the cumulative effect of that is. And so I think news outlets like the Globe and others are responsible for the narratives that they create. And they have a responsibility to step back and ask, add it all together. What is our coverage telling people about this subject? And I think that was something that didn't happen for far too long, and it's something that we're trying to change now.
So you can go ahead.
Yeah, no, a bunch of things come to mind. Yes, what he's saying about the 70s. There's a wonderful book, High in America, by Patrick Anderson, about that period in the 70s when 11 states decriminalized marijuana, and the Carter administration actually introduced a federal, not legalization, but decriminalization bill. So yes, there is that history, and it's true. I was saying in the 80s, it kind of gets swept away as the drug war heats up. Now keep in mind that drug war was very much a bipartisan, multi-partisan, multiracial war on drugs, right? There were a small number of people standing up against it. You know, it was my early years. There were some conservatives, William Buckley, Milton Friedman, Kurt Schmoke, the former mayor of Baltimore, Ira Glass at the ACLU, but it was it was like McCarthyism on steroids. Right, in the sense of this period of public hysteria and such. And reporters just got swept up on that. The notion of drug reporting was jumping in the back of a cop car and going on a raid or a bust. And the New York Times, the Washington Post, Newsweek Time, the big major media outlets were as guilty as the most scandalous press. The stuff they covered, when you look back at it now, was like yellow journalism, like the old stuff 100, just ugly, stupid, what have you. You know, years later, Max Frankel, who had been the executive editor of the New York Times and retired, he writes a piece. And he says, you know, it's time for our profession, the journalism profession. It's like what happened with the Vietnam War. You know, in the first years of the Vietnam War, the reporters just all jumped on, the RV, did all this sort of thing and covered it like they were part of the team. And at some point, the David Halberstams and the others of the world say, wait a second, there's a lot of stuff going on that's not true. And he said, it's time for reporters to do that, to cover this thing critically as a war, to be war reporters who don't just join in, but actually look critically at this. Not easy to do, but that began to happen. The other thing I just want to say about this thing is, let's remember, right? I mean, we're very conscious now, with good reason, of the racism that permeates the war on drugs and the war on marijuana. The origins of the marijuana criminalization, going back to discrimination, prejudice against Mexican Americans and Mexican migrants, all this sort of stuff. We know the disproportionate effect on especially black and brown populations, and the stuff that you heard in Barbara Lee's thing right there. But at the same time, I don't want to rewrite history in this area as well. Because I remember the ferocious opposition I would get 20 and 30 years ago. I'd be up there in the late 80s and 90s talking about the war on drugs, war on marijuana, war on minority communities, right? And the same sorts of things that my young colleagues, black, white, and brown, are saying today. And I would have not just white senior political figures, but black senior political figures going after me. Who are you to be saying this? Who are you talking about? Drugs destroying our community. The Charlie Rangels, the Jesse Jacksons, my debate opponents, not my allies as they are today. So let's not whitewash or blackwash or whatever you want to call it, the history here. There was something going on, and when we're looking at the accounting of this thing, and when we're talking about bringing in racial justice, don't wipe out the history of how much complicity there was in the war on drugs, not just by people, white conservatives, but by white liberals, brown, black, and what have you. So I think now we have to just keep pressing on this thing, Terrell. That's the thing. I mean, it's about educating journalists, taking the time, pushing them to do the right story. When they write a story and they get the facts wrong, perspective wrong, it's getting right in their face politely and sometimes not politely to say, fix it up.
So Shalene, I know you have something.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly note, I think there's an affirmative duty. If you're part of an institution that participated in this, even if you didn't participate personally, I think there's an affirmative duty to try and address that. And I think about some of the campaigns I was involved in as an activist. And in the early days, especially, there was a lot of what's been termed white exceptionalism, where you call for legalization by referring to the underground market or the illegal market as the black market, the violent gangs, the cartels, and setting up this idea where we need to move it to a regulated market. And you use words and language that imply really that it's a white market. And so I use some of that language, and now I regret it, and I say so openly, and I try and make up for it. And I think in the same way that if you're part of a media institution that started the war on drugs, that, in Massachusetts, it was the first state to actually make cannabis illegal, and they called it Indian hemp. Like, they didn't even try to hide their racism. And I think if you're a part of that, now it's on you to try and fix it.
Yeah, so it's a good point, Ethan, that you were bringing up. And part of my job is to interview presidential candidates, and I ask, a wide range of questions dealing with drug reform, right? And I deal with, and one of the candidates, I'm not going to name the person because it just doesn't make any point to it. But, this candidate said that, people think that Black people don't want more policing, and no, they actually do. They want more policing, and I'm looking at this person. I'm thinking, you know what? Of course, if the only option to deal with a social problem that was constructed by white supremacy is that you're going to give them more police, yes, they're going to take that option if that's the only one you will give them. right? That's the only option. If you give the people police, and more police without understanding the social, economic, educational conditions, it's not going to change anything. So I think it's incumbent upon us to push back against these people and not want to be their friends and want to take selfies with them and want to be a part of their little crew. Because journalism is a very clubby industry that people don't want to tell you, but it very much is. And people really want to be, ingrained with the elite of the people that they're supposed to cover with objectivity, right? So I want to move forward and talk with Tanvi in particular about, particularly about immigration enforcement and, the criminal justice apparatus that exists in how the narrative on the war on drugs, it intersects with, with immigration. So can you just...
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to give like a couple of facts about where we are today, and then maybe draw from a couple of the historical points that you all brought up, because I think there's just like, bells ringing in my head with a lot of things that everyone said. So if you're an immigrant, whether you are undocumented or you are in the process of being or the process of citizenship, right? So I have a green card. Having a small amount of marijuana can get you deported. Okay, that is still the case. It does not matter if your state and local laws, whether it's a civil infraction, because the way that immigration laws are set up, since it's a federal crime still, it's absolutely a deportable offense. Even if you don't have a conviction, just admitting that you have or deal with marijuana or have in any way related to it can create a problem for you in the immigration process. So there's that. That's the reality today. And I think that a lot of the, what we've heard about the war on drugs really dovetails with what we're hearing about immigrants right now. And, just to take a step back, sort of look at it historically, some of the big, of course, at the heels of the war on drugs, some of the big laws that were passed in the Reagan and the Clinton administration actually have set up the system as it is today, whether that is internal enforcement. So, folks who are inside the country who may have lived here forever, may not really, again, have a conviction or be criminals as they are called by this administration and previous administrations, will be deported for something like this, right? The second is at the border, right? And the border, by the way, stretches way inside. We are inside the border zone right now, which means that if a Customs and Border Protection officer was here, you could check my papers and that would be fine and absolutely legal. And of course, if there's any marijuana on my body, I would be, that would be the end of it. So those systems have been set up because of how those laws dovetailed, both sort of overlapping immigration law with criminal justice, with criminal law, kind of what I like to think of it as like kind of a Frankenstein-like monster of like the war on drugs, the war on terrorism, and just like bad criminal justice policy, all kind of in one package. That's what we're really seeing today. So. A couple of things that you said, for example, Ethan, this thing about going on drug busts or raids, that's very much still being covered when it comes to immigration, right? Like, people are going with ICE and covering how that in a sort of sensational way. So I think that we're still not there yet when it comes to covering immigration and the effect of specifically of immigrants as it pertains to, drug policy at all. And I don't think we're connecting those dots, even though they're like basically the same thing.
And so I'm gonna let Ethan speak. So after we do this, we're gonna move on to the next question because I'm trying to be efficient with the organizers with time as possible. And we started at 10:05. I wanted to ask, I don't know where's Layla here. I'm trying to make sure we can go to 11. Where is she? Okay, sure. Somebody tell me. So go ahead.
So I was just going to add on to what you're saying about the intersection of immigration and the marijuana reform issue. And I'll tell you just a little history on California. There was an effort in California in 2010 to legalize marijuana. It was led by Richard Lee, a medical marijuana activist in the Bay Area. And we all got involved with him. And it was a rare case of an initiative winning even though it lost, because it transformed the national discussion. It made all of a sudden legalization look real because it got so close. But what we found in the polling was that white and black were relatively in support, close to 50%. But Hispanic, Latino, Chicano leaned against. And the worst sector of all, the entire California population, were older Latinos, like 90% opposed, right? So we knew we had to fix this in some way or another. So as we move forward, DPA, the advantage of working not just on marijuana reform, but ending the entire war on drugs and also dealing with drugs as a health issue, gave us an edge. So what happened around 2014, 2015 were a number of what were called crimmigration bills, right? Addressing the ways in which the criminal justice system and even criminal justice reform could actually backfire on immigration issues. So my staff and one of my colleagues, Armando Gudino, in our LA office, got involved and played a pivotal role in building coalitions with Latino and immigration groups around these crimmigration bills, one of which Jerry Brown signed, one of which I think he vetoed. That way, we built our bona fides with the immigration groups and Latino groups. And the next year, when the initiative's coming along, Armando's in a position to say, guys, we delivered for you on crimmigration issues having nothing to do with marijuana. Marijuana is a pivotal part of the story. You got people getting kicked out of the country, marijuana offenses. Yeah. Will you now step up with us on the ballot initiative to legalize marijuana? And in a significant shift from what had happened in 2010, a huge proportion of the immigration and Latino groups stepped up, joined with a coalition. The proportion of Latino population supporting marijuana legalization increased, and it played a key role in the victory.
Yeah, so thank you. I want to add another thing too. When we think about immigration, the element of it, we can't forget our local policing, because local policing works in concert with organizations like ICE, right? And so when you think about people who are stopped on the streets, a lot of people are not realizing that Black immigrants in particular, those from the Caribbean, those from the continent of Africa, are more likely to be deported, like at the higher rates. And the reason why is that Black folk are stopped and frisked all the time, right? And if you find out that the person is an immigrant, they're referred to ICE. That happens all the time. And so just imagine being a Black person walking down the street, you're stopped by the NYPD, you have, marijuana on you, and you're undocumented, then you're automatically put into the system. So all of these systems work in concert with one another. So it's just something important for us to keep in mind. And very briefly, if you don't,
Yeah, very briefly. Yeah. Just on that point, I wanted to mention that I did a really sort of an investigation and mapped the border zone, which is, 75% of Hispanics live in the border zone. And one thing that is I wanted to mention was the checkpoints that Customs and Border Patrol set up in these border zones, which have known to be only efficient at stopping people who are legally allowed to be in the country with small amounts of marijuana. Yeah. That is the thing that we found, according to Customs and Border Protection's own data, that sort of system is good for. And by the way, they're not actually supposed to be for for general crime enforcement. Right. They're supposed to specifically be for immigration enforcement, but this is what they're doing. And that's a good point.
So I think what everybody in this room obviously understands is the only reason why journalists able to do anything or push or anything, journalists very much focus like public officials. And it's because activists push the subject to the point where you can't ignore it anymore. And I think that in this conversation, I want everybody to leave feeling empowered about how they can use media in order to push the narrative. And I want to bring an example of social media being at its best use in 2014 with the killing of Michael Brown in Missouri. And it wasn't the people who really were telling the stories in the most nuanced way weren't the local trained media. It was the activists on the ground who had the smartphones, right? And so if it was not for them, then a lot of stories would have been told inaccurately, right? And so there's a way that journalists feel that we are the only people who are supposed to tell stories, and that's 24-karat BS, right? And so you all have the ability to tell stories. You may not necessarily be a journalist, but you can tell your story. And I wanted to talk to Shalene about how important have activists been in kind of pushing this, and combating this negative narrative about the war on drugs, and how can we be empowered to work with activists, and what can we learn from them in order to really tell their stories?
First, I just want to say how grateful I am that Thanvi is on this panel, because it's making me realize that when we have these conversations, we so often forget immigrants who use drugs are people, sex workers who use drugs are people, people with records who use drugs are people, and it's really great to hear that included.
Yeah.
So very effective. I think activists have been very effective in this conversation. Dr. Nadelman brought up the coalition in 2010 that was built for the California initiative. That coalition is still very active online. And I think that's an example of all of these tight-knit communities that are built around cannabis in a really unique way, where in Massachusetts, we ran a social justice campaign. We built a strong coalition there, and they're still very much in touch and mobilized. And all of this isn't happening in a vacuum. There's, in general, with media, a change where younger people, especially, actually people of all ages, they're not getting their media from the same institutions anymore. They're getting their media online. They're preferring context and analysis versus some of the old models.
Yeah, right.
And so when you look at those two factors together, and also consider that in cannabis, you can become a subject matter expert actually fairly easily if you just sit down and read the regulations, or you're paying attention to what's going on in your state. It's not as establishment driven as in other areas. For example, if any of you follow Marijuana Moment, Tom Angel's newsletter, he's entirely self-taught, self-made, and it's from him just following the news really well. There's someone in Massachusetts, you may know that mergers and acquisitions are a really big deal in Massachusetts now. There's a 2-woman compliance firm called Galen Diligence, and I actually get a lot of my news from her Twitter, because she follows all of the she follows the press releases that come out about acquisitions, and she comments on them. So in general, I think that activists can be really responsive to news. They can add context, analysis, and they can use these giant coalitions that we've built to be impactful.
Thank you so much. Dan, very briefly before we move on to the final question, so we can have time for a Q&A.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add that, at the Globe, we work with advocacy groups a lot, not because, as objective reporters, it is not our place to sort of help them further their policy objectives or help advance their cause or anything like that. But it's so important to get real authentic voices in our paper. And so, for example, when you're talking about a community like immigrants, those can be people who may be afraid to speak up, to have their name in the paper. And an advocacy group is a great portal into a larger community that you may not have access to personally as a reporter. So I find that those groups are very helpful for us to connect with the voices that we actually need to hear more from in the paper. I think the media has a really strong authority bias. Some of you guys have talked about this, right? About like the ride-alongs and things like that. It's not that those are illegitimate stories on their own. It's just that if those are the only stories you're writing, you're really not doing your job. And so, and another thing that's happening in Massachusetts is the conversation has moved way past whether to legalize. Now we're talking about how to legalize, who profits from this newly legal industry. And there are a lot of factions within pro-pot, as you rightfully said, that's way too simple a moniker. And so something that we've tried to do is write about the different advocacy groups, which have actually competing policy priorities in many cases, and actually illuminate the differences between them and show the full diversity of thought within those communities.
It's a good point. I wanted to, as we get into our final question, which is there's a dearth of people of color covering drugs in general in the cannabis industry, and we want to talk about why that is. But I wanted to touch on something where you talk about objectivity, and I'm not saying this directly to you or to anyone, but I work in a Black-run, kind of Black woman-run website, The Root, and I come from much of the term objectivity. It's a very problematic term, and the way that I look at objectivity, it is a function. Objectivity within the construct of journalism is a philosophy that stems from a white supremacist construct, right? Because when you think about the way that different media function, objectivity to me as a person who's been directly impacted by these negative narratives on the war on drugs. Both my uncles sold drugs, and the way that I grew up in that environment, and the way that I see these people, that my family are completely different. I look at the reasons behind them selling. I see them as entrepreneurs within a white supremacist construct that gave them no other choice, right? And so objectivity is something that people who have no stakes involved in the subject, right? That's the way to look at it, because when you think about Black media has always, when you think about some of the famous Black newspapers that were actually teaching Black folk how to integrate up north for a better life, right? And so it had to be activist because it was our lives that was at stake, okay? And so I think that when we talk about media coverage, we have to think about what the subject is and who has a personal stake in what they're doing. And I think, and on that note, our final question, we're going to be a little shorter with this one, is I want to ask people on the panel very briefly to kind of talk about, and I'll start with Tanvi. There's a dearth of media of people of color covering these subjects. I want to ask you, how problematic do you think, what kind of problems can that lead to?
So many problems. I mean, this is one thing that I think a theme that seems to be coming out just generally in some of the subjects that we've covered in this conversation, so much more, is that these are institutional systemic things, narratives and systems that have been created. And it's not like any one person or the other, but that includes the journalism industry. We are not diverse. We just look at any publication. This is a huge problem. And then, even within that, there's even a smaller faction of journalists of color covering these issues. So, and there's there's reasons for that, right? And I don't want to sort of write off anyone's personal agency and choice on doing whatever they, covering what they want to. But, a lot of young journalists often come to me and are like, well, you cover all of this stuff. Like, I don't want to be pigeonholed. I don't want to go to an organization and have them just be like, oh, you're an immigrant, you should cover immigrant issues, or you're Black, you should cover these issues, because that itself is also an imposition and an assumption and based on certain assumptions. So on one hand, I understand that, but what I always say is like, and this goes back to the objectivity thing, I can't leave who I am at the door. That's just not possible for me. So I'm just going to use it to tell better stories. And so, I think that is really something that we need to be thinking about a little bit more. And it really does tie into your what you were saying about objectivity. I think, fairness and balance are really great things that as journalists, we should be fair and balanced. But I don't think any of us, all of us are human. We can't be objective. So when we are looking at the system that is already steeped in, in a certain direction, we have to take a step back and kind of think about that.
So we have like 15 minutes left, and take a couple seconds. Ethan, I'd like to hear what you have to say very briefly, just if you wanted to add something.
Yeah, just, so let me just be provocative here. I mean, on the one hand, we know that sort of racism in the history, especially with whites and Blacks in America, is a sort of defining characteristic of our nation's history. And it's permeated the criminal justice system, all these other systems. And I'm very sympathetic to the points that are being made here. And we've had to be very conscious of it. It's obviously shaped issues of the war on drugs and the way people think about the harms of the war on drugs. But I want to make another point here, and especially because, thinking as a drug policy reform person, where this marijuana battle is increasingly won, and where the next frontier is trying to end the criminalization of all drug possession, so that, like Portugal, what have you, so that nobody goes to jail for possession of any substance for their own use if they're not hurting anybody else, and also thinking about issues of legal supply, especially with the overdose epidemic. But there is another ism that permeates our society, and to some extent the world, and for lack of a better word, it's not a good word, let's call it drugism. Yeah. That there is a level of discrimination, right, and ignorance and prejudice across white, Black, and brown, right, with respect to people who consume drugs. Yeah. And druggist prejudice, druggist anti, and so I could be visited by a reporter, it could be a white reporter or a Black reporter, but if they tensed up around drug use or drugs, it was going to be a problem. If we were talking about MDMA or ecstasy and people, and the same, whether it's journalisms or activists, this sense, even as we're making some progress over the last 30, 40 years in dealing with racism in our society and delegitimizing racism in its most formal elements, drugism emerges as the new legitimate bigotry and prejudice in our society. You can talk about junkies and drug addicts and this and pushes and all this sort of stuff. And even though it links with race because it's disproportionately seen as race, but it's not just that. The things we're willing to do to people solely because of what they choose to put in their body is a vicious form of discrimination. And that's the one that we have to dig a lot more deeper to uproot.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think I hope you're getting your questions ready. And I wanted to leave this towards the end. We can't talk about any of these things until we have a wider conversation about white supremacy. Right. And I want to leave this by saying all these things are organs of white supremacy. When you think about, and I look at media as a tool of white supremacy. Media, as I have grown to understand it, has functioned in this country as nothing more than a white man's diary. That is what it is. It tells white stories for white audiences, from white perspectives, from a very puritanical point of view where shame is involved. An example, talking about the use of drugs. And I say this as somebody who is a journalist who I grew up in a house where both my uncles sold drugs. That narrative, those neighborhoods that people were, the reporters were covering, I saw those reporters come into my neighborhood when something bad happened. I saw my grandmother refuse regularly to talk to reporters anytime some act of violence got shot. And you have to remember, as a 6-year-old kid, that's something that's built into me. I have a master's degree in journalism. I've covered stories around this world, but I will never forget looking up at my grandmother speaking to this blonde, blue-eyed white woman on several occasions, telling her no. And so it informs what I do in my work. And one of the book that I'm working on deals with explaining how foreign policy works through the perspective of my uncles who sold drugs. Because as I came to find out, as I started traveling, diplomats pretty much function as drug dealers. The White House is a trap house. It functions just like that, right? And so if you don't come from that background, when you really you're not going to look at it like that, right? And you're also working at a Black publication where I am empowered to tell those types of stories. So I have a number of colleagues at major publications that I won't name who have to take an extra shot in the evening because they have to deal with some insensitive white person who just doesn't get it. That's just, and that's the reality, and that's just the reality, right? And because it's not, they're not in the fight. And so it's time for the Q&A. And again, who has a question?
Can I make a brief point before the first question?
Yes.
Just briefly, I have to be objective too as a regulator, and I feel like I'm in the same spot as white journalists sometimes because there are no Black or Latino people on my commission.
The Black ones have to play the game too, but it's another story, but go ahead.
It's so obvious to me, no matter how much I try to learn and be objective. And I would give a shout out to the Drug Policy Alliance and the Boston Globe newsletter, This Week in Weed, that have done a really good job to move the conversation forward productively. If you're not Black or Latino, you'll never have those experiences. And we need Black and Latino journalists on this issue, and we need Black and Latino regulators, period.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I don't know how the Q&A is going to work. So I guess everybody's going to stand up, take a mic, or the mic's right there. You want to go first? I see you, but go right there. And yeah, you should line up, and I will point out people until the next 10 minutes are up, I guess. So, and tell us your name and what's your question to whoever's on the panel.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dabbed Out Dubs. The question I want to ask this panel is I'm glad that they talk about the opioid epidemic right now, but there's a quiet, epidemic with spice, K2. It's not synthetic marijuana, number one. It's, it's pretty much, destroying African-American men who are in the system that have to use that drug because during 2011, they weren't testing people, you know what I'm saying, for K2 because it costs like $1,000, you know what I'm saying, to test in order, you know what I'm saying, for those drugs, you know what I'm saying, to be in. And by the time that person's off probation, they're still on K2. Right. So why, you know what I'm saying, are they not talking about spice as much as, you know what I'm saying, they're talking about the opioid dependency?
Got you. Thank you so much. Anybody want to take that?
Well, I mean, it's a legitimate issue. Some of the big market for spice was because people were being tested for marijuana. And you'd be in the probation parole system, you'd be in the military, whatever it is, in job, and you get positive. So people turn to, spice because it's not, or synthetic marijuana, whatever. It's, all this stuff is given random names and nobody knows exactly what's in it. So it is a serious issue. The issue about introducing drug checking so that people are using these drugs on the streets or whatever, whether it's opioids or the synthetics or the K2s, can actually know what they're doing. That's something you're seeing more and more pop up around Europe, beginning to happen in the US. So I think that's an important way to deal with this stuff too. I don't think what we need to be doing is testing people for K2, because drug testing people and punishing them is basically the wrong way to go.
Absolutely. Thank you. And so briefly, because I wanted to get on there.
Yeah, I would just say that that this is one of those issues where it helps to have a reporter who is like full-time on drug issues and can do the work of unpacking and explaining for the readers what actually is K2. Why isn't it synthetic marijuana? How is it different from that? Why is that phrase a misnomer? And not, it comes back to that authority bias I was talking about. You can't just accept necessarily, the police's description or characterization of a substance. You actually have to go out and say, what actually is this substance? And
that's how we're trained to do in many cases. That's the thing people don't know. We're trained to accept the police perspective.
So I would just say that when it comes to that, there's education that I think that the media can help with by explaining what's really going on there. And just in general, like, just talking about people who consume drugs in a respectful, non-judgmental way. It's not our place. We don't have to be judge, jury, and executioner. And I think that the best journalism is journalism that moves towards the specific, that talks about specific people instead of large groups of people far away.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And you're next.
My name is Gary Stein. I'm the political director of Florida Normal. I also have a political action committee called Clarity PAC, which is the first nonpartisan political action committee in Florida. And I've also been a journalist. I used to work for the Huffington Post when they had a contributor section. I did a lot of other blogs. And I try to educate advocates, journalists, and legislators. And on the operative phase in medicine, of course, is do no harm. Legislators are constantly telling us that. I'll make this quick.
Yeah, question.
Yes, I'm going to head to the question right away. Is that with the journalists, it's always about words matter. And I've been trying to change the lexicon in Florida for a long time, in part just the words marijuana and cannabis. If you do a quick research for the bills, you get two different lists entirely, and there's very little overlap. So there needs to be some kind of consistency. But the other word that I'm working on right now is we need to get the word recreational out of our lexicon, because it was the opposite of recreational is not medical, it's professional. So the legislators, when they look at us, when they hear that, they think a person who is recreational is not professional, who is not productive, and most likely a stoner on the beach. So I'm asking, the words responsible adult use in place of recreational. Is it doable?
Go ahead, Dan.
So just a couple things quickly on that. One is, one thing I'm involved in is trying to put together sort of a society of professional cannabis journalists. And what I would like to do is create resources for those reporters who don't have the luxury like I do of covering this full time, sort of a glossary and FAQ, resources that they can lean on when they're on deadline and they've got to quickly write that story and they don't necessarily have time to unpack the nuances of marijuana versus cannabis and all that. I don't want to defend the word recreational too much. I would just ask you to appreciate that in the media, we have a tough balance to strike sometimes of using words that are commonly and widely understood by a large general audience and that are not jargony. And I think adult use is something that's maybe on the cusp of becoming better understood there, and that could change with time.
Thank you, Dan. That's a very excellent point. I think people really don't appreciate the ways in which we have to balance the various audiences and the language and vocabulary.
But there's a loaded way to use that word.
Very much so, yes.
There's a more dispassionate way to use that word, and context matters a lot, and the tone of the writing around that word matters a lot. So that's something that I pay close attention to.
Yes. Hi, I know you.
Hi. My name is Deborah, and I'm coming to this from a bit of a different perspective, which is I'm a retired Department of Justice attorney from the criminal division. And two things occur to me in listening to this whole thing. The first is that marijuana has kind of been decriminalized for the white population forever. basically. That said, back to the narrative on the war on drugs, and I'd like the journalists to address this, is that, and you touched on it a little bit, all the journalists have touched on it, but that is that police have a narrative that they want to get out that serves a purpose for them. And the drug reporting tends to just be a police narrative, which I consider a kind of lazy journalism, because you're just parroting a police narrative which serves their purpose, which helps them get convictions, and it's kind of non-critical. How do you break out of that type of reporting? I see it across the board on all crime reporting, and especially drugs.
Thank you very much. You want to take that, Tanvi?
Really quick. Yeah, I mean, I completely know what you're talking about. I think crime reporting is just, I would like to, I think, point to what, I mean, I guess it's easy for me to say too, because I cover policing. So I can actually take a step back and look at the broader sort of narratives that, or you know, strategies that the police is sort of selling, and be able to be critical about that, right? Because I don't specifically cover crime. I think crime reporting, maybe, I don't know, maybe you can talk to this a little bit, but I think it's kind of like dying out, even hopefully, because I think that kind of incremental coverage, again, like doesn't connect the dots, doesn't give you the context, and is not able to challenge the so I would say the journalists who are able to take a step back is a way to do it.
Oh, go ahead. So you can touch.
Just a quick point on that. I'm just thinking about the issue, say, on marijuana arrests. And, you know, you do have a problem. Crime reporters don't want to alienate the police because those are the sources, in the same way White House reporters don't want to alienate.
Precisely.
So you have that kind of bias.
Yeah.
Now, what are the things you do about that? I think about Harry Levine, Queen's University professor. Google Harry Levine marijuana arrests. His not just analysis and reporting, but writing reports that then lead to a major ACLU report that helps reframe the issue of why the cops arrest so many people for weed and why it's so racially disproportionate is pivotal. And then when that same guy who's doing that is then forming relationships with journalists and editorialists, including Brent Staples, who just won the Pulitzer Prize, and educating them on the reporter level, editorial level, that's part of what makes change happen. So the way that marijuana arrests have been covered in, for example, New York and other places in the last few years is radically different than the way it was covered 6, 8, and 10 years ago.
Absolutely. So we got 3 more minutes. Try to get, hope I could get to you, but we're going in this order. So
yes, my name is Jason Zergos. I represent the Alternative News Media Association. We represent papers such as the Washington City Paper and Dig Boston, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Dan. We don't have necessarily the objectivity problem because we've always been, pro marijuana and had a natural, suspicion of the police and police narratives and government narratives. I guess my question is, we have had a diversity problem. The All Weekly industry, I'm usually the only brown person in the room at our conventions. And so, we don't have the objectivity problem. Most of our papers have 420 issues coming out this week, but how can our papers, who consist of mostly white, younger white reporters, cover this better from a diversity angle and cover racial equity issues?
So we have one more. So we have a couple more minutes. And so who wants to top us off with that? So anyone? So I guess, okay, I'll go for it. So one of the challenges in mainstream media newsrooms is that the gateway into journalism is extremely difficult and damn near impossible to break. Yeah. And so I was able to get an internship when I was a graduate student. And so I basically I had to work for free. And most people of color cannot afford to work for free. You'll be amazed at the ways in which your white colleagues are able to get these jobs, and in ways that we cannot, because mommy and daddy is underwriting their expenses. And I'm not saying all white people are like that, but in many cases it is. And so again, we can't talk about this without talking about white supremacy and the economic inequity and the flat out racism of what we consider to be a qualified person to be a writer. Right. And so I know we have to end it, but ultimately, until we deal with the white supremacist construct that formulates journalism, it will not change. Just like policing will not change because it cannot be reformed. Just like certain aspects of the criminalization of drugs, it cannot be reformed. It's something that you just have to abolish. And so until you get an abolitionist approach to dealing with these things, and these problems are going to, it's like putting a Band-Aid on on a gunshot wound. And so this is kind of it for our panel. I hope you all enjoyed yourselves, and I want to thank you.
Director of Legislative Affairs for the Maryland State Chapter of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, commonly known as NORML. Our goals are the same today as they were when our organization was founded in 1970, to move public opinion sufficiently to legalize the responsible use of marijuana by adults. Public support for this goal 40 years ago, when we got started on this journey, was only about 12%. Public support today is about 60%, and it's above 50% across all major political parties. We are motivated to do this work not because we love marijuana. We do this work because we love liberty. We're motivated by a nonpartisan belief that we must maintain a high standard for when to deprive a person of their liberty, and the risks posed to society by the responsible use of marijuana by adults does not justify depriving a person of their liberty. So it is no coincidence that a fierce defender of liberty, constitutional law professor Jamie Raskin, would carry that same nonpartisan vision into his political career and become one of the most effective advocates for sensible marijuana policy reform during his tenure as state senator in the Maryland General Assembly. While serving in Annapolis from 2007 to 2016, then State Senator Raskin successfully sponsored legislation to establish Maryland's medical cannabis program and to decriminalize the possession of small amounts of cannabis. Jamie also sponsored bills to establish a rational tax and regulate system for a regulated adult use marijuana market in Maryland and to expunge marijuana arrest records for low-level offenses. He was a trendsetter. And although these goals have yet to be fully realized, Jamie did leave us a lot of work to do in Maryland as he moved on to his current position, serving in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing the people of Maryland's 8th Congressional District. So in Congress, Representative Raskin is continuing to support nonpartisan, common sense marijuana policy reform. He does so in his positions on the House Committee of the Judiciary and Committee of Government Oversight and Reform. He supports allowing cannabis businesses to use federally insured banking systems. He wants to allow veterans to have access to medical marijuana through the VA system. And he wants to end cannabis prohibition at the federal level in the United States. So for demonstrating his leadership on these and many other nonpartisan, common sense public policy priorities, my family and I are proud to be represented by Congressman Jamie Raskin. So on behalf of Maryland NORML and the residents of Maryland's 8th Congressional District, please join me in welcoming Congressman Jamie Raskin to the 2019 National Cannabis Policy Summit podium.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Luke, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. You brought me back to the days when I used to get legislation passed in Maryland. It wasn't like dealing with the Trump administration. We were doing, relatively easy things like abolishing the death penalty and passing marriage equality and enacting medical marijuana and decriminalizing marijuana in our state. And I'm thrilled to be able to be here with you, Luke, with Maryland NORML, and with all the other groups that are participating in this important conference. It's a pleasure to be able to take a break from talking about the Mueller report to talking about another urgent matter of public policy. Luke observes that we're not in a partisan context here. We're in a nonpartisan or bipartisan or multi-partisan context. So I thought in that spirit, I would start by invoking our last great Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, who spoke of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I think that this issue tests the resiliency of the great Lincolnian ideal. Can we be enough of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people that we can get the government to catch up with the people and to end the disaster of marijuana prohibition? I do think that we should view the marijuana laws in their proper historical context, like their historical precursor, which is alcohol prohibition. Marijuana prohibition has been a disaster at every level for our country. It has criminalized and stigmatized millions of our fellow citizens. It has prevented lots of young people from having the opportunity to find careers, get an education, move on with their lives and grow successfully, all for doing something that most of our most recent presidents have readily admitted to doing. It has strained the criminal justice system with billions of dollars of expenditures on marijuana law enforcement and prosecution. It's corrupted large parts of the law enforcement system, police departments and prosecutors across the country. It's been a disaster in terms of public health, and essentially has been a terrible diversion of financial, social, moral, political energy in the country. And if you think about it in the context of alcohol, alcohol is a far more dangerous and pernicious threat to the public health than marijuana is. Every day, 30 people lose their lives to drunk drivers. And that's more than 10,000 people a year. Alcohol is extremely addictive, and we know what it has done to so many families and so many communities across the country. And of course, marijuana doesn't produce anything like that. I remember when we introduced our decriminalization law in Maryland, the chief of police in Annapolis, the Annapolis chief of police, his last name is Priscoop, came and testified against it. And his staff apparently had prepared for him this speech. And in it, he announced that on the very first day that marijuana was legalized in Colorado, 37 people had died of marijuana overdoses. And I was startled to hear it. I said, there goes our legislation. And so I very quickly Googled it online, and his staff had prepared a speech based on an article on Comedy Central. And so I, began to ask him questions about, were there young people who died of overdoses too, or was this just adults? And, I let him play with the fantasy for a few minutes before I had to break the news to him that not only had no one died in Colorado from a marijuana overdose, but nobody can find a single example of a marijuana overdose in the country. We had a police officer who came to testify on behalf of our legislation who said that whenever they get a domestic violence call, almost inevitably alcohol is involved in it. But marijuana is never involved in it. He said, the worst that happens if you get a marijuana call is you show up and the people are watching Twilight Zone reruns and eating nacho cheese Doritos at 2:00 in the morning. But we're not dealing with domestic violence and all of the other problems that are associated with alcohol. So if we were to be engaged in a system of criminal law enforcement to try to drive out some scourge in the country, clearly it would be alcohol rather than marijuana. But we tried that, and it didn't work for alcohol. It didn't work. We had a constitutional amendment, the 18th Amendment, adopted in 1919, and it produced nothing really other than organized crime and the mafia in the country. It just drove all of the alcohol use into the speakeasies and the flourishing trade in illegally produced liquor. And alcohol and the bootleggers and so on. And the country came to its senses because this is government by the people. And in the 21st Amendment, we reversed it a couple decades later. But it did ruin a lot of people's lives in the meantime. It did corrupt law enforcement, everything that we're seeing today. So let's learn from history. Let's avoid any further damage to our people. And I'm sorry to say that Congress is way behind the states here. More than 30 states have now decriminalized marijuana or legalized marijuana or adopted medical marijuana programs, as we've done in my home state of Maryland, I'm proud to say. But there are more than 100 million Americans who live in states where we've come to peace with the idea that grown-ups should be able to make their own choices about marijuana, and there are positive medicinal uses for it. And I know that because I've seen people come and testify who've had everything from AIDS to multiple sclerosis to terrible nausea created by chemotherapy and so on. There are lots of people who absolutely swear by it and say it's the only thing that works for them. Congress does need to catch up. We've always gotten the best ideas and the best social movements arising out of the states and state level legislation. That's how we got the child labor laws. That's how we got the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote. That's how we got direct election of U.S. senators. And I think that that is where the energy for change is going to come from in order to overthrow the restrictive marijuana laws that continue to bedevil us and keep us in the dark ages of society. It's just a cruel and repressive system that we're locked into, and I'm glad that there's so much social movement around the country to liberate us from these laws. I think I had time for a couple of questions if anybody had one, and otherwise I'll go get back to the Mueller report. I don't know. It's,
I'll ask a question.
Yes.
Can you give us a sense for what you see happening legislatively on this issue? Can you leave us with a sense of?
Well, the good news is that there really is a cross-party coalition, which I saw forming in Maryland between progressive Democrats who have had it with marijuana prohibition and the younger, more libertarian Republicans. You know, the Republican Party has still a dominant authoritarian law and order wing, but there are libertarian Republicans too, younger ones, who also understand the unreason of the marijuana laws. And so there's a guy who I consider otherwise irredeemably reactionary named Matt Gaetz from Florida, but he's very good on the marijuana issue. So we've made common cause in advancing legislation that would allow for medical research. You know, one of the problems that we encountered, Luke, in Maryland is people saying, well, there's no good federal research on what the real positive health consequences or negative health consequences of marijuana are. And the drug war forces have kept it that way by preventing us from doing medical research. So this legislation is an attempt to open up a space for real medical research into what the positive and negative effects of marijuana use are. All right. Oh, yes, sir.
There's been a great advancement in the state of Maryland with the medical program, but yet there's no legislation regarding the right to home cultivate for the citizens. Where's that going to be?
The question was about the prospects for legislation on home cultivation in Annapolis in the state legislature. And I'm afraid I'm not involved so much in the daily struggle in Annapolis anymore, so I don't know. But one of the delegates that I work with from District 20, David Moon, is a huge champion of home cultivation and liberalizing the marijuana laws. And I know David is working on that. And I imagine that same coalition I talked about could make some progress on it. And that question really does pose the essential problem of freedom and liberty. I mean, we're talking about people in their homes and being able, to grow on their back porch or what have you. And I think that would probably be the next thing that happens before we get to full-blown Colorado-style legalization in the state. Yes.
When you were talking about government research and they need research on it, how about throwing it to government their own research in regards to the Department of Health and Human Services patenting cannabis, basically, or trying to patent marijuana, where it's patent 6630507, where they verify that it's beneficial for help with cancer and a number of other medical benefits. And they all need to wake up that we know. And we're tired of their crap, because we the people and Weed for Warriors say weed the people now.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think there's much to add to that point. I think that's well put. You just heard from real experts. All right, well, I'm going to get back to the Hill. Thank you very much for having me. So.
Good morning and welcome. My name is Queen Adesawi, and I'm a policy coordinator at the Drug Policy Alliance's Office of National Affairs here in DC. I've lived in Washington, DC for 7 years now, and though I'm a native Bronxite, and I'll do all I can to give the warmest welcome to this amazing DC homegrown leader that I have the honor of introducing today, Mr. Tony Lewis Jr. Here in the nation's capital, I work to advance drug policy reform that ends the racist and classist war on drugs on the federal level and locally in DC. I come to this work deeply committed to the truth, which is that the US war on drugs has been a war on Black, brown, and poor people. For decades, the US government has perverted and stigmatized a plant that many of us know all too personally as a healing agent or as a means towards financial and social mobility. In a society where your life prospects are seemingly mapped out for you based on the color of your skin, oftentimes your zip code, who you love, things like that. This plant has been used as a tool for state violence in a way that has literally destabilized whole communities, torn apart families. There's blood on the hands of drug war zealots for all of the life and life potential that has been lost or unable to bloom. And despite the systemic guerrilla warfare vulnerable communities across the country have faced, here in DC, Tony Lewis Jr. has used his voice and leadership locally and nationally to empower those most impacted by the war on drugs and mass criminalization, from people coming home from prison to family members that were left behind. I would need much longer than a few minutes to do justice by Mr. Lewis's life work and impact. The magnitude of his impact for more than 15 years is as comprehensive as this nation has to be if we are ever to turn the tide on mass criminalization. Mr. Lewis has been a relentless community leader, workforce development specialist, reentry expert, and champion for children with incarcerated parents, informed by his own story that is chronicled in his book, Slug, A Boy's Life in the Age of Mass Incarceration, which is available today if you'd like to purchase a physical copy. He will be gracing us with an excerpt from his book today. And before I pass the mic off to one of DC's most fearless advocates, I'd like to end with sentiments emphasizing how it should never go understated the levels and dimensions of harm that people have faced because of failed drug policies, all the potential that couldn't be because of failed drug policies. And as we inch closer and closer to a post-prohibition world, we cannot stop demanding that the lens in which prohibition ends is centered in acknowledging the truth. And most importantly, we cannot stop demanding that the end of prohibition is centered in repairing and atoning for those harms. We have the chance to build the fabric of a new industry on the front end, to flip the script and have race and one's criminal record actually be a qualifying point of entry for individuals, which we are owed. We have a unique opportunity to have a stream of money funneled into our communities for generations to come. We have the opportunity to generationally change the course for so many individuals and families and communities, whether through direct employment or ownership in the industry, or through any of the ways that revenue can be used to invest in our communities. With that said, I would like for everyone to help me give a warm welcome to Mr. Tony Lewis Jr.
Good morning, everyone.
Visits are the greatest way to keep the connection strong. When you're in that visiting hall together, the walls disappear and you just focus on being in your loved one's presence. Visits are the closest the incarcerated come to the outside world and being free in it. Over the years, I've seen what has become of Appalachia on my visits to prisons. It began with our road trips to visit Uncle Greg at Lewisburg in Pennsylvania, and continues today with my trips to see my father, cousins, and friends. On behalf of CSOSA, I also speak at federal prisons up and down the East Coast. So there, in the brick and mortar, I've witnessed mass incarceration become a well-fortified institution in this country. In addition to the prison industrial complex, where inmates get paid a pittance to manufacture goods for the public, prisons have also become the lifeblood of small towns across the U.S. The transformation of old economies, what used to be primarily steel and coal country, has become prison country. In Western Pennsylvania, there are Allenwood, Canaan, Lewisburg, Loretto, McKean, Moshannon Valley, and Schuylkill. In West Virginia, there are Alderson, Beckley, Gilmer, Hazleton, McDowell, and Morgantown. That's about 13 federal prisons set up in the hard-hit economic areas, providing thousands of jobs. This is a small sampling of the federal prisons in 2 states I'm the most familiar with. There are hundreds more federal, state, and private prisons spread in the remote areas across the country. Driving through those remote areas on my way to visit, I found myself thinking less about the big picture and more about the moment. Those drives demand that you remain focused on what's in front of you. FCI Cumberland, which is my father's prison, is in the mountains. I've driven to see him when the fog was so thick, the prison wouldn't admit visitors because of the poor visibility. So I have to just turn around and go right back. Of course, I have no choice but to keep my composure because the road ahead was incredibly foggy and I was driving down windy mountainous roads alongside big rigs. Another time I was turned away because I was wearing a sweatsuit. The dress code is serious while visiting a prison. There's a long list of things one must remember before setting out on a journey to a prison. For example, women can't wear underwire bras. It takes thought and preparation. When Uncle Greg went back to prison in 2001, he was sent to USP Allenwood. Once, when a few of us were going to visit him there, Grandma got turned away because she had undergone 2 knee replacements and the metal in her body kept setting off the metal detector. She had forgotten her medical card, which explained her condition, and had to miss the visit. Having fully patted her down and searched her, they still couldn't take the chance of letting her through. We understood, but after a 4-hour drive for an old woman wanting to see her son, it was a big letdown. There was another time going to see Uncle Greg. We stopped to get something to eat before arriving at the prison. Uncle Alvin had taken some of his high blood pressure medication with his food and didn't think anything about it. Well, when you go into these prisons, they're not only checking for weapons, but also drugs and other contraband. To test the drugs, they run a cloth over your pockets and your hands and then run it through a machine. Doc didn't have any drugs on him, but the residue on his hands from his high blood pressure medication was enough to turn him away. My family was aging, and we were still making the trip. Knee replacements, high blood pressure pill residue were things we didn't have to think about before. Now we do. My cousin Rico and my Uncle Lo, who was Uncle Boo's in-law, were also incarcerated at Allenwood with Uncle Greg. Coincidentally, my barber and good friend, also named Rico, had an uncle incarcerated at Allenwood as well. On one of those road trips to Allenwood in late 2011, Rico came along with me and my family, including Grandma, Uncle Alvin, Nikki, and her son Dominique, and Kim. I requested Rico. Grandma, Doc, and Nikki requested Uncle Greg. Kim requested Uncle Lo, and Rico requested his Uncle Dern. With everyone in the visiting room together at some point, I had a moment to step back and look at the scene. There was a man from both sides of my family, another who married into the family, and a friend of the family, all incarcerated in the same place. Of course, I knew this before being in the visiting room with all of them, but seeing them all together was striking. 3 out of the 4 men, excluding my cousin Rico, were serving life sentences. It was one of those disturbing moments where I almost could not believe my eyes. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Amber Littlejohn from the Minority Cannabis Business Association. Founded in 2015, the Minority Cannabis Business Association is the first national trade association geared to serving the needs of the minority cannabis industry and our communities. Our mission is to create equal access to cannabis businesses and economic empowerment for our communities by developing social programming, policy, and outreach initiatives to achieve equity in the communities most impacted by the war on drugs. As an advocate, I can tell you that leveling the playing field begins with policy that addresses the needs and concerns of our communities. MCBA's policy efforts center on ending prohibition of marijuana, community reinvestment, and restorative justice initiatives. The cannabis industry today has all but shut out the victims of the failed war on drugs as patients, employees, and business owners. Despite lip service from industry, we are not seeing real investment in our communities. It's time for industry to step up to level the playing field and address the needs and concerns of the communities upon the backs of which our industry was created. Without further ado, please help me welcome to the stage Elizabeth Nolan Brown, moderating the next panel, Leveling the Playing Field.
Everyone, thank you for being here with us right now. I'm really excited to be moderating this panel. My name is Elizabeth Nolan Brown. I am an associate editor at Reason Magazine, and I am here. First, I'm going to let actually everyone introduce themselves instead of giving their introductions. If maybe you could just, we'll go down the row and just say who you are and kind of just briefly what your relationship is with this space and this topic.
Okay. Hi, everybody again. I'm Tony Lewis. I think I'm probably like the novice on the group as it relates to the cannabis industry, but I have been a fighter and a champion for those impacted by mass incarceration on the reentry side and on in terms of children with incarcerated parents. So I feel like my voice here is to add a perspective of not just about rather things that decriminalize or legalize, but how do we truly incorporate those that have been the most affected by drug policies and mass incarceration.
Grover Norquist, I run Americans for Tax Reform. In addition to the general liberty issue, we run into this because the federal government tells people who sell marijuana legally in Colorado that they may not take normal business deductions because in the early 1980s, they changed the law and said for Schedule I drugs, you can't, which means the 35% corporate tax was for a normal business selling cannabis in Colorado, a 35% sales tax. You weren't allowed to, it wasn't a tax on profits, it was a sales tax. So it's down to 21, but it's still devastating and it interferes with any efforts at federalism.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Sunshine Luncho, and I'm an attorney based in California. I currently am Vice President of Legal for Flocana. We are working to build the world's largest brand that supports small craft farmers in California. I also served as the mayor's appointee to the Oakland Cannabis Regulatory Commission and started working in this space when California first passed our medical statute that would have licensed medical businesses.
I'm Jonathan Blanks. I'm a research associate at the Cato Institute here in town, so a libertarian think tank. I work on criminal justice issues, primarily policing. On a personal level, my father was a police officer for 20 years, and my brother was incarcerated for a nonviolent drug offense. So I bring both a professional and personal interest in fighting the drug war.
Great, thank you guys all very much. So, as she mentioned before, this is obviously this panel is about leveling the playing field, ways that sort of the legal marijuana industry is failing victims of drug prohibition and just sort of not accruing benefits back to the communities that have been hit hardest by the war on drugs. I'm going to start with Jonathan, and I'm just going to ask, everybody's going to get sort of open with, 5-6 minutes of comments, but let's start with Jonathan to ask you sort of specifically, since you cover, regulatory research and all this stuff and policing research, how are laws and policies really preventing us from leveling the playing field and keeping, victims of the drug war out of working in the legal industry or just sort of out of the benefits that are starting to accrue in the legal industry?
Thanks. So part of the problem is we started thinking of it as, the prohibition regime that we've been fighting on for a long time, and then the legalization regime. And when you get, I think people look too far ahead when we've legalized the drugs that the problems are over, but that's actually not true. The people who have been arrested have faced consequences that can follow them for the rest of their lives and prevent them from getting all sorts of employment, and that were basically called collateral consequences. And there are about 45,000 of these collateral consequences on the state, local, and federal level for arrests and convictions. It's not just for drug arrests, but because drug arrests are the #1 reason that anyone is arrested in the country, this is who are going to be punished. And when we also think about drug arrests, as the last panel was talking about, we're all talking disproportionately about Black and brown young men. And it's because while the law is colorblind, police have decided to enforce the laws primarily in these Black and brown communities. And so what you have is, even within a legalization regime, like in Massachusetts or here in DC, you still have we are still continuing to create victims of the drug war that cannot integrate well into the economy, whether it's the legal weed industry or if it is other parts of the economy. So in places like Massachusetts, as I mentioned, they have these dispensaries that are licensed. They're very expensive to start up. So the people who have already suffered in the drug war are not going to be able to get the capital and don't have the resources to be able to enter into that business very easily. On top of it, when they are the few places that do have legal dispensaries, they're in the suburbs. So if you live in the city and you don't have access to a car and you don't have, and you're not living near where the dispensaries are, you still can't get that marijuana or get to that job, right? So too often what I think we look at this legalization regime, which is actually just supporting the status quo ante that was already decriminalized for middle-class whites and above, but not so much for the people who absolutely need relief from the years of suffering that we've implemented. So I think it's very important that we try and make marijuana legalization real for everyone, because right now in practice it's not true. We think the laws change, but the policies still exist. The Boston Globe reported that 75% of all the cannabis sales in Massachusetts in 2019 are going to be illegal. That is not a functioning legal market. Here in DC, where you're allowed to possess, you're allowed to carry, but you're not. But you can't sell it. You can gift it, but there can be no exchange of money or merchandise. So there's still, again, no legal market for marijuana here either. So when we first legalized, the police department was dropped arrests dramatically, which was great. But since we got a new police commissioner, arrests have started ticking back up. They have started enforcing against the entrepreneurs who have tried to skirt the law and let's say gift liberally. We'll put it that way. So. But the problem is they're still going to be enforcing that law. And where are they going to be enforcing it? They're going to be enforcing it against the people who don't have access to the legal market. So I think it's really, it behooves us to try and actually make not only the law, but the policy equitable across everyone.
Thank you. We're going to go to Tony next because, you mentioned that you said you're sort of new in this space, but I guess you mean to maybe the policy realm because you've been working in this space.
Oh, absolutely.
Advocacy for a long time.
Sure, but just not cannabis wise. That's
right. Okay. Yeah. But so in general, where do you, in your work that you've done in this community, this is sort of the same thing, whether we're talking about drug convictions, people with drug convictions, whether we're talking about their barriers to the legal cannabis industry or just their barriers to sort of employment when they get out in general. What do you see in your work with those communities? What do you see as the biggest problems?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You spoke about the collateral consequences and having a criminal record, and really how permanent, how far-reaching that can be, how limiting that can be for those the most impacted. So when you talk about particularly here in the District of Columbia, where your growth industries are hospitality, banking and finance, healthcare, and IT. And then government, and you have to be obviously have 75% of the jobs here. You have to have a bachelor's degree to even be eligible. And so for those returning to our communities from incarceration, or those that never went to prison but pled guilty and to felonies or what have you, are on probation, the barriers to getting into employment can be tremendous. That's what I do, help connect those dots. And then I feel like in any place where if we're talking specifically about cannabis, if cannabis is legalized, and in DC really is decriminalized, not legalized yet, but in any event that for employers specifically, I think that should be taken off as a screener. Like alcohol, you don't get disqualified for alcohol when you're applying for a job. I think I would like to see immediate expungement for all marijuana-related offenses as well. Those are the kind of things that we need. And then moving forward past that, obviously, racial equity, and not to make it hyper-local. I know we're talking about America, right? And I felt like I hold true to this for all places around the country, but specifically in the district where marijuana arrests or arrests in general hover in the 90th percentile for Black people, right? So when we talk about who's going to be the growers, the owners, it should be a mirror image of those that have been to prison.
Just to follow up real quick, you said that, that's what you do is help people connect the dots. So what kind of things do you see that you have to help them do?
So preparation for the job market and employment, building relationships with the business community so that they will be amenable to allowing individuals to give our guys and our women a shot.
Because a lot of people just have that as like a box to check off on,
sure,
on a
what's
form, right? And then they'll just sort of reject it.
It's a good point. Well, here in the district and other places around the country, there's been this movement around ban the box.
That's what I was wondering about.
So that box has been removed. You can't ask, you can't ask until you're ready to make a conditional offer. And so where the reality of banning the box, it really doesn't change anything. It just changes the process. So I like you, and I think you did a great interview, and I want to hire you. So now I ask, have you have a criminal conviction? And if my hiring policy states that I don't hire people with criminal convictions or with felonies, then I can't hire you, even if I want to. So we also have to push again to move the needle. We got to really start to challenge hiring policies, look at rational relationship. And if we're talking like specifically about cannabis, I don't know how many jobs really has a rational relationship to like smoking weed. Like, how does that endanger, unless you're high like on the job? And so again, I think we have a lot of work to do. And so the conversation around or the push for legalization and all those kind of things, please, for those that's at the forefront of this, and there's many people in this room, you cannot leave out. We got to see this all the way to the end. If we want to see or have the cannabis industry be the model industry for inclusion and things like that, then we have to cross all of those T's and dot every I to ensure that those that have been the most impacted have an opportunity to participate.
Thank you. That's actually a good segue to, I'm going to go to Sunshine next, because having worked in this field, both, as well, you said you've owned your own cannabis business and you advise other people, right?
I know where you're going.
Sorry. I just want to say, you've had a lot of experience, working with people directly in this field. As we've been sort of talking about here, both there's the policing aspect that's not helping different communities, but also it just still seems like even in places where it's legalized, and especially if it's a highly regulated legal market in some of the states, you see just so much of this new cannabis industry that's popping up being sort of run by wealthier corporate enterprises, just sort of a lot of people, the same people you see leading a lot of businesses, and sort of, maybe leaving out women and people of color a lot. And so I was wondering if that's been sort of your experience, and if so, why you think it's harder for us to have a really diverse ownership in this industry.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful to illustrate a little bit how I got to be in my current position. So in 2015, my first job in the industry was writing applications for the Maryland licensing process. I'm from Maryland, but I live in California. And part of the licensing application process in Maryland back in 2015 had a disqualification for people who had drug convictions. And so you were running background checks on these would-be license holders, and it became apparent early on to me that that in my own home state that had worked to decriminalize, we were going to be excluding major populations. In California, it's interesting to sort of compare different marketplaces, right? So in California, when I was on Oakland's Cannabis Regulatory Commission, we were looking to create a system, a social equity program that actually prioritized people who grew up in communities that had been most impacted by the war on drugs or who themselves had been incarcerated. And at the time, it was the first program of its kind. It is not a perfect program, but it was a model. And we quickly saw throughout the state and country, other municipalities take on this same model. So now in California, we have social equity in San Francisco, Oakland, Los Angeles, and Sacramento. But these programs are imperfect. I'm a lawyer and I provide businesses with regulatory and other types of legal advice. If you are unable to access my services, you can't pay for my fees, and you're a startup, how are you going to figure out how to get into the marketplace? So it was clear to me in 2015 and in 2016, as we were having these conversations, that no social equity program could exist unless it provided free technical assistance to these people who were qualifying for the programs. Because as we all know, cannabis businesses have no access to banking. They have no access to traditional lending. So when you try to go talk to the Small Business Administration in 2016 and say, hey, our governor, then Jerry Brown, passed MCRSA and I want to open my own medical cannabis business, can you help me come up with my business plan? They say we can't use our federally funded programs for you. And so the solution that we are seeing that has popped up, and again, it's imperfect and it's a work in process, is for each of these different municipalities to offer technical assistance. And Oakland has a loan program. It's a 0% interest loan if you're able to qualify. And that way it will at least help defer some of the regulatory burden of the marketplace. But when we're talking about the devil is in the details and our laws are supposed to be colorblind, when you are writing a local ordinance that explicitly excludes people from participating who have prior convictions, as we see in other parts of California, you are creating a system that locks out the people who fueled the market in the first place. And then when you have a dual licensing system like we have in California, there's still the chance that you might be disqualified. We've been fortunate that our state has been very welcoming of the social equity programs. We actually had a social equity bill passed. Our Senator Bradford, he's based in Inglewood, was the main author of that bill, but the funding hasn't been released. So here we are in 2019 in California, trying to transition a marketplace where by and large, most of our municipalities do not have access to legal licensing. Los Angeles, that has a social equity program itself, the next 400 or so retail outlets are supposed to be owned by people who have been impacted by the war on drugs, but they just authorized the funding to Cat Packer, and it's not enough. And so my concern, now that I've been in-house for 2 cannabis companies and practiced in private practice and seen what the alcohol laws look like, is that we won't catch up soon enough. And we are writing these laws that exclude people. And if they do include people, they don't include them soon enough. And quickly people are outside of compliance. And there's a robust, thriving illicit market in California. That has not changed. It is hard to encourage people to participate in a robust market, in a legal marketplace when the cost is so high. The taxation that Mr. Norquist referenced in Colorado is possibly double in California. Our sales tax is, at 10%, but we have an excise tax. We have a tax per gram of cannabis. And so once you get to retail, people experience sticker shock who have voted for legalization. And so I think, there's, at least as my company sees it, we believe that the farmers are like any other agricultural farmer in America. They grew up, some of them multi-generational farming in the Emerald Triangle. And the only difference is that while their neighbors were growing wine grapes, their parents also might have been growing cannabis plants. And their experience growing up was of helicopters, raids, seeing their parents arrested. And now they are putting the faith in our company to try to bring them into the regulated market, to provide the support so that they can be treated like any other business. And there's a lot of distrust in that for some people because you're identifying yourself as someone who's cultivating this plant. And there's a lot of fear that they will somehow lose to larger corporate interests because we have made it so burdensome to participate.
That's a really good point because I think, thank you. it's really interesting, like how you bring up that in a lot of ways, we have a lot of governments, state governments, and otherwise saying, no, we don't want you to do this black market anymore. We've had it. It's legal. Come to us, do this. But then at every other opportunity, whether it's with super high taxes or with, rejecting people who have different things, it's just like, you're actually not welcoming really people at all. And you're not incentivizing people at all to.
Yeah, and I think that there's this misconception that there's a lot of money in this industry. Like certainly there will be when we have a global, fully regulated marketplace. But the reality is that the cost of the startup cost for businesses has probably tripled or, at least quadrupled in California specifically. If you came to me in 2017 and said, I think I'm going to try and start a brand, you could start something small with like $25,000 to $50,000, like a reasonable amount of money. Now, if you wanted to start a brand, I don't know that you could do that unless you had at least $1 million because you're going to be paying lawyers. You need to find a facility. There aren't that many places that will license you. We keep adding more and more regulations. Our regulations changed 6 times last year, and our final set came out in January. Who has time to read 300 pages? I mean, I enjoy it, but nobody wants to do that. So it's challenging.
That is a really good segue down to Grover, because I wanted to ask you, your sort of when we talked before, your biggest concerns here are the ways that our federal policy in all these ways that people don't think about because they're not the obvious, going out and arresting people ways, but the things with taxes and banking and regulatory codes and all of these different ways, like death by 1,000 cuts, that they sort of hamper the legal business. So,
right, you pass a initiative in the state, the legislature, Massachusetts, Vermont legalizes, and you think, done, right? It's now legal. It's going to be like going to the grocery store, maybe like buying some prescription drug or something, but it's going to be legal. And the answer is because of federal law. It used to be, and I'm surprised other children weren't taught this, but my parents taught me when I was very young, that if you decide to become a bank robber and they caught you, you would have to pay taxes on your ill-gotten gains, but you could take all the deduction for hiring your henchmen and so on. And this is true for all crimes, and was until in the early 1980s, somebody in the Colombian pharmaceutical industry got arrested in the United States, and they said, we're going to put you in jail, and we're going to tax what you earn. He said, fine, here's what I earned, here are my costs. This got in the newspapers, and the press went nuts. And even though this is true for robbing banks or anything else that you do, you can only get taxed on the profits of what you're doing. They said, we've got to pass the law, 280E. They passed this law that said for Schedule I drugs, you cannot take any deductions for the costs of selling drugs. So even though you now, and this is marijuana to LSD to heroin, even though you now may legally sell in Colorado, marijuana, the federal government's 35% up until recently, last year, 21% corporate income tax is a tax on all sales because you can't take any deductions. Add to that, the state has added a 25% tax because it's all free money. I mean, they've been watching too many movies and they're quite convinced that this is, the Al Capone and the Colombian characters with gold-plated toilets. And so they're going to tax everything and it's all free money and no one will really mind or notice. So you've got the federal tax across, and then you've got the ban on banking with anybody who has a nexus with the federal government, and that's most banks, maybe all banks. And they make it very difficult for people to bank, which means everything's cash, which leads to all sorts of other problems. And now the cheerful news is at the federal level, there's the States Act, which is put forward by Cory Gardner out of Colorado, Republican, Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts, and the president has said he'll sign it. And the Republican leadership has said they're looking for a must-pass bill. The House should be okay, but I've been told this for 6 months now, and it hasn't happened yet, but we keep getting told this should happen momentarily when we have a must-pass bill. Of course, whenever somebody says there's a must-pass bill, that is an opportunity for every boat anchor dumb idea to be attached to it. So we're competing with everybody who goes, oh, they have to pass this. I've got a stinker of a bill I've never been able to pass. If you want my vote, I want to stick that on it, which then can sink a must-pass bill. And good riders or good additions get pushed out by bad ones. So it is entirely possible that before this year is out, we get the States Act passed, and the two biggest challenges presented by the federal government, since Bill Barr, the Attorney General, has agreed that he will not ask people to prosecute. It's still illegal to sell it federally if it's not statewide, even if you can bank and even if they don't tax it, oddly. That's something that could be rescinded someday, but right now, I'm going to leave it alone. That's probably good enough for government work right now. So that's getting the feds out. However, the states can screw it up even when our team thinks we just legalized it. And one of the biggest mistakes I think a lot of advocates of decriminalizing cannabis have made is in making the case for it should be legal, they say it's just like liquor. Well, you don't want to be just like liquor or spirits or wine or beer when it comes to how you're regulated, because when we got rid of prohibition with the constitutional amendment, they stuck in there that it wasn't protected like all other business activity. By the Commerce Clause, states could regulate it and have the three-tier system and have a government run. I mean, we sell liquor in New Hampshire like the way they used to in Bulgaria in 1952 with state stores run by state bureaucrats who have zero interest in being open anytime that anybody wants to be near them. Why would you ever want to say we should do marijuana that way? It was a stupid way to do liquor in Bulgaria. It's a stupid way to do liquor here now. And so it's one thing to say, like liquor, sort of like liquor should be legal, but you carry that too far and you end up regulated like liquor. Or in some cases, the people pushing some of the decriminalization laws actually got money from the people who do the wholesale business, which has crippled, damaged the liquor, wine, beer industry and made it difficult to function. They go, we want to be the wholesalers and get our vig off of marijuana as well as liquor, beer, and spirits. So you can set up a regulatory structure almost as stupid and expensive as prohibition. In Colorado and some other states, taxes alone guarantee a black market, outside the law market, because inside the law is too stupid and too expensive and doesn't open on Sundays. So whereas other hardworking people do work on Sundays. So I guess my concern is that we need to, in a hurry, it ought not to be in a hurry to compromise in a way that perhaps 10 years ago it made sense. This is the only way I can get across the finish line. Let's do this. And then we litigate. I much prefer the North Dakota law, which was just, it's legal, done, and not explain how to structure it. We don't tell McDonald's how to structure themselves. We don't tell hardware stores how to structure themselves and where to get their licenses. So just legalize it. So we're going to have to go back and rethink Washington State and even Colorado and some of these other states, which thinking they were compromising, or California, where they raised taxes so much, but they bought all the opposition off. The reason various law enforcement structures and prison guards didn't object this time around in California was they were showered with cash. Okay, but if you want to start reducing those taxes, you've now got to argue with the people who are making a living off the cannabis industry without doing any work. So we're getting there on the federal laws, getting those out of the way. They've been a problem. I believe we are on track to get it done. It should happen sooner rather than later. Everybody who could stop it says they don't want to. We'll see. And then at the state level, we're making our own problems when we run an initiative. The New York bill to legalize marijuana was, 700 pages? Okay, I haven't read it, but you can do this in 2 pages. The rest, everything after 2 pages is taking things back that you just said you gave people. So again, 700-page bills are always a bad, Lord knows what they're doing on page 340. And it's not like where they could, your friends would mark the naughty bits in novels for you, but, to find out where the key parts are, you have to go find this yourself through the law. So that said, I think we're generally getting there. I like the state-by-state approach. Bad ideas can only be imposed in Washington on everybody at once. Good ideas can be done state-by-state because, hey, look at this. It got better. People didn't all crash their cars on Tuesday like they said they would. And people still go to high school and things like this. So when you can calm down false fears by doing it in one state, and then another state moves, and then as it moves across, hopefully we'll get better and better state legalizations, and then we can work backwards to the first guys who made ridiculous compromises. Understandable, perhaps, when you're looking at going from 0 to 1, you promise a lot because nobody's ever done this before. But we don't need to make those compromises at this point moving forward. So state by state, I think, is working well. I think it'll get us better state laws. And then when we get there, the federal decriminalization should look more like, okay, and it's, just we're out of here. You guys handle this. Which you would not get if it was federal down and Washington thought they were doing it because they'd have the 700-page bill. And then we'd never get rid of it. New York can look silly and people can, and there'll be a black market to compete with the regulated ones, and there are other states you can go to. So New York will have to get better. If the feds do it stupidly, the answer is you don't have to get better because you're not competing with anyone.
So we brought up in what, as dovetailed with what a lot of other people have said here, and it's sort of the decriminalization versus legalization. I know drug policy world uses those terms a little different. I write a lot about sex policy and sex work and how, a lot of sex worker rights activists, they don't want legalization, which would be, they want that, but first and foremost, they want decriminalization. Remove all criminal penalties, and then you can talk about having a legal, for brothel structure or whatever. And so, in the drug policy world, it seems most people have gone straight into let's build this legal structure first before decriminalizing. And that seems to be the root of actually so many of our problems and why we haven't been able to level the playing field. So does anybody, have any comments on that, on the what needs to come first, or?
I think, I would support a decriminalization structure, but the problem is that usually means fines. Instead it's going to be, instead of going to jail, you get a fine or a ticket or something like that. But a problem, again, if you're still enforcing that in the poor Black and brown communities, you can't afford the fine. Then those add up over time. You lose your license to suspension. The cop's going to pull you over, get you for a suspended license, and boom, you're back in jail. And so it's not that I have opposed decriminalization, but insofar as just making it legal to have and that the cops can't do anything about it, provided you're 21 years old, that would be a better way to go about it.
I think we're talking about the same thing, just using different words, but just the removing of criminal penalties or civil penalties first.
Oh yeah.
And then worrying about the structures, sort of. Is that an impossibility though? Like Sunshine from your realm, is that just impossible at the state level?
It's not impossible, right? Because I think Maryland decriminalized before California legalized. I'm trying to remember. But Oakland is an interesting example because the Oakland Cannabis Regulatory Commission was created under Measure Z, which was a local ballot measure that decriminalized cannabis. And their entire focus before I joined was to just get reports from our police on the policing of marijuana crimes in Oakland. And by and large, this is not surprising to anybody who has been listening today. The people who were arrested or who had contacts with the police, by and large, were Blacks and Latinos. So to me, I've been thinking a lot about the gaps that we have in our legalization statute in California. And to me, the biggest at-risk community are transition-age youth who are not in college. Because people 18 to 21 are not going to be criminalized for possessing cannabis currently. But if you are someone who is of lawful age, you're 21, and you provide cannabis to someone who's under 21, there are severe penalties for that. And I recognize that I had the privilege of being on a college campus that did not care when I started consuming cannabis. Stanford didn't care. Not everybody is going to be at a college campus that didn't care or even be in an institution. And so you're not having the laws reflect the realities of how people conduct themselves. And if under our medical statute, we were fine with people 18 and over possessing this, setting aside whether or not it was medically efficacious for them, why suddenly when we legalize are we removing that ability from the same population? And so I don't know that decriminalization with fines solves the problem, but I think that legalization with some period of time for continued decriminalization is important. Because depending on where you were cultivating in California between 2015 and now, a single county has banned and allowed it and banned and allowed it and banned and allowed it. And I don't know if you know this, but this product grows under the sun. And once you plant a plant, it won't grow again if you chop and burn it, right? And we have law enforcement that is still very much interested in getting these dollars. They think it's attractive to go and search a cash-based business. And so we have lawful licensed operators who are first approached not by our regulators currently in California, but they have their local district attorneys getting a search warrant that also includes an order for destruction. And so about 3 weeks ago in the Central Coast, we had law enforcement show up at a 7-acre greenhouse that was licensed by the state of California, and they intended to slash the entire $7 million crop, right? And had that licensee not been represented by counsel who could call someone quickly who happened to just be walking out the courthouse to go find a judge to issue an emergency stay on that destruction, they would have lost what some people have put into these businesses is their life savings. And I think that when you think about like how we're going to be enforcing, it's really important. And to Grover's point, we passed in California our legalization initiative because there was money for police. And there's actually, if they ever realize their revenue estimate of $1 billion, there's buckets of cash, none of which are going to go to my public schools. They're not going to fix my roads. There is some $10 million amount in there for communities most impacted by the war on drugs. But once you average it out, the remainder goes to law enforcement. And so when we're talking about lowering our taxes and making it easier to conduct business, there's some pretty strong interests that don't want to lose their sort of foothold. And we're a very large state. And so I don't know that decriminalization helps, at least Black and brown communities, as much.
Yeah. I think the criminal justice reform movement, which has gone through quite a number of states, and recently we got the federal law passed with bipartisan support, First Step Act, which is a first step, but it's a good first step. We got that done because of the unease the country and even legislators had with the way cannabis was treated and the way cannabis users were treated and the way it seemed a lot of nonviolent people were being arrested and harassed and going to prison, and this seemed to be wrong. And that infused a lot of the energy into the whole conversation about criminal justice reform in its entirety. And I think we're going to get some benefits from that because that discussion has dealt with reentry issues and how do you make it easier for people who've been in prison to get jobs. The occupational licensing reform, which is a side issue, because when they decided to set up a little cartel and only let certain people be a realtor or do your hair or whatever, this first rule they come up with is no felons. And then they go down to all the other ridiculous rules that they have, but they start with that one, regardless of what the topic is. And we're now seeing that whole issue of occupational licensing rolled back. It used to be 30% of all the business, of all people who had to get a permit in this country to work. It's now down to 21.7 and falling. It used to only be 5, then I went from 30 down to 21. So a number of these things are civil asset forfeiture. When they stop people's cars and don't even arrest them and don't even charge them with anything, but take the cash that they've got on, they take the cash with their ATM machines, and they take the car because they think it was maybe bought with illicit drug money. And then, of course, you can sue if you want, but the lawyer might cost more than your car or than the money you had on you, or you may have other things to do in your life than to go back to Oklahoma that you were driving through and handle this. You've seen the numbers that more money is taken by police in civil asset forfeiture than in burglaries last year. So we're dealing with several $1 billion a year. As this gets stopped, and it's getting stopped by state, some wonderful law in New Mexico, that I think also makes the cannabis industry and drug industry in general less of a target, because that's the one you can always imagine. We think that cash came from, they don't say from bank robbery, because then you might say, what bank? But they just say drugs. Well, who knows? So the criminal justice reforms that are happening and will continue to happen, I think help as the cannabis industry expands.
Tony, did you have any comments on anything that they've been saying? You've been quiet for a while now.
Yeah, no, I'm just taking it in, but I do think, just to Crow's point about in terms of how these things align, where we see sort of the culture of reform in our country. And I'm always trying to just be the voice of like, do those reforms go far enough? And are the people that know the most about the real impacts at the table when these things are being decided? And I've seen it consistently be where we think we're covering all bases, but we haven't even started to scratch the surface. Because of that sort of, there's a desert as it relates to those that are the most in the know. With that being said, yeah, I think that, not to clap, but that's really just the truth. And so with that being said, for me, as it relates to things being decriminalized versus being legalized, I really just, again, want to continue to drive home, think it all the way through. And I think in a lot of big things like this, right, this is big, so we do it in increments. But when we do it that way, sometimes we will never get to where we're trying to go. We really have to tackle this in this drug policies and people impacted by mass incarceration in a very holistic way. And at the same time, that sounds daunting, but we have to, because if not, then those that are the most stable, and that's why you find in terms of who's going to be the leader in the cannabis industry and the owners in the cannabis industry is going to be the same owners and leaders that are every other industry. Yeah. Well, so I'm done.
I think we have about 5-10 minutes left. So if anybody has any questions in the audience that they maybe have time for one or two. Can't see, does anybody? No?
Hello, my name is Brea Vaughn. I am the founder and CEO of the Unforbidden Plant Project, also known as TUP Project here in Maryland. Basically, the concept of my organization is bridging the gap between generations while educating them on alternative healthcare, which is this is what medical marijuana is. And I'm 25 now, but when I was 19 years old, I was arrested in the park for smoking marijuana. And imagine getting arrested by a cop that is your skin color, and they are arresting you because they want to meet a certain quota so they can get a couple extra dollars on their paycheck. And my TUP Project is a online-based community and also outreach in the community. And one of my main goals in the community is to educate people on medical marijuana, what it can do for them. And my goal also is to, like Mr. Tony was saying, about mass incarceration, because us African Americans, we always get criminalized for medical marijuana. And to be held in a cell for 12 hours, then have to go to court and just start the charge, and then they just gave me a day of community service. I was like, for what? So I want to know, what can TUP Project do to help fight this and give people like myself and others that have been incarcerated for longer periods of time? Like, what can TUP Project do to help push this movement with giving the failed war on drugs a second chance, victims a second chance?
Does anybody else?
I mean, I would, so really quickly, I think organizing and mobilizing is so important, and getting people that have been the most impacted, particularly in places where their rights have been restored around voting, to get them civically active and politically active so that they can play a role in the political process, and the people that get in office will feel a necessity to address their issues. And the other thing would be, like, we have to have conversations, even in particularly around hyper policing and things like that. We got to get in the same space with law enforcement and have those conversations, so that I feel like we can share information. We can see things from their perspective. They can see things from our perspective, and through those conversations, I feel like we can get to a better place. But it's important that we continue to organize and sort of make that a cool thing, like civic engagement, political engagement. I don't think we see that enough, particularly from the communities that, like, I represent, that have been the most impacted. We got to have people at the table. It can't be just, so then we get what we get. It's people that's representing those communities. It's not of those communities, but so we got to step up to the plate.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that. Thank you for your question. When we were going through the regulatory process in California for our medical statute, I went to Sacramento regularly and I wasn't being paid to be there. And I tried to get other people to come with me so we could go talk to our assembly members and our senators and educate them on what it was like to be in Oakland trying to transition businesses. And some people had the time and others didn't.
Yeah.
And the people who made the time and could be there are now being called upon to speak with our legislators when they're thinking about changes to our law. Right. So when they wanted to have the automatic expungement bill, it was the assembly member that represents my area that passed it. When we talk about taxes, it's the person who represents my area that has brought it forward. Right. So I think it's important that you develop a relationship. It may seem overwhelming to try to go to all of the Maryland Assembly, but at least start with your personal representative.
Thanks. Got one more question. We have 5 minutes left.
Okay, hello. I represent Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and this question is for Grover. You mentioned that there is these must-pass bills that come on the floor of Congress, and one such maybe as the States Act. That when that happens, that everyone brings their worst ideas to tack onto a bill. But I think that many advocates in the room here today are on the same page about some key policies that should absolutely be a part of any federal marijuana legislation. These reparative justice policies are automatic expungement, mechanisms for resentencing, and taxing marijuana revenue to be reinvested in communities who have been targeted by marijuana prohibition. So I just wanted to ask you if these provisions are things that you would support tacking onto the States Act.
The States Act is not the must-pass bill, okay? I may not have been clear. The States Act is what is the bill that everybody would like to do, but if it's standalone, a handful of guys in the Senate can delay it and so on. So what we're looking to do is put it onto like the agriculture bill. That's what I thought we were doing last fall. It turned out not to be the ag bill, or a debt ceiling bill, okay? So we're one of the Christmas tree ornaments that you can attach to an oak tree that everybody agrees, okay, it's gonna have to go. And so they're not gonna shoot down the entire agriculture bill because they don't like this, or the debt ceiling bill because they've worked it out. As to what can be added to the States, I know the States Act can pass. I believe the States Act can pass. I'm told by the people who care and are trying to make it happen and who can count votes because they live in the Senate that it can and will pass when we pull the trigger. Whether if you add more to it, do you sink the ship or do you make it better? That is the sort of thing right now that you talk one-on-one with Elizabeth Warren and Gardner. And if they think it can hold, then it would go on. If they think it loses you 2 votes, then you probably don't get it this time.
So you would not support those policies if it prevents the bill from passing?
I would not insist on attaching one more thing if it meant you didn't get anything at all. That's my advice on almost all pieces of legislation I like. Pieces of legislation I don't like, oh, you should put many things on that and watch it sink. But I would like to pass the States Act. I think it's an important first step. Could it be improved and passed? Maybe. I would defer to Cory Gardner and Elizabeth Warren, who are counting votes.
Thank you.
I think we're out of time. So could we just give one more round of applause for all of our panelists up here today? Yeah, thank you guys.
Impact licensed, non-licensed, ancillary, vaguely related businesses. But before we jump in, I do want to do some introductions. So why don't we start with you, Kaylee, and then we'll go down the line and just give us a brief introduction of who you are and how you found yourself here today.
Absolutely. So my name is Kaylee Wilder. I am the CEO and co-founder of Estro Hayes, Inc. We are a digital media company all about bringing resources and information to communities of color, in particular women of color, to empower them to, get into this business and embrace the lifestyle.
Thank you, Ricardo. My name is Dustin McDonald. I'm the Vice President of Government Relations for Weedmaps. Weedmaps is the oldest and largest technology company in the cannabis space. My way of being here is through policy, while we do a lot of interaction with government on the right way to organize policy to sufficiently generate enough access for patients. Ultimately, we run off of a technology platform. And as an operator of a technology platform, we have considerable issues with a lot of other technology platforms that tend to oversee ours. That's why I'm here today.
Right on.
And
Yeah.
I'm Letha Knott. I'm the Executive Director of the First Amendment Center at the Freedom Forum Institute, which incidentally is located in this building, so I didn't travel very far to get here. But essentially, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that focuses on educating people about how the First Amendment and how free speech and free expression in general work. And part of that mission is that we pay very close attention to the kinds of speech that are allowed and not allowed on social media. Not exactly a First Amendment issue, but an issue that impacts the public conversations we have about everything. So that's why I'm here.
Wonderful.
My name is Mike Whiter. I am a producer for Now This. My main focus is Now This Weed. We produce cannabis content, video-driven social video news content, mostly on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, social media stuff.
Great. Thank you, guys. Thanks very much. And I know I got the brief introduction up front, but I did start the Cannabist at the Denver Post. And now my gig is Grasslands. We're a PR and marketing agency specializing in highly regulated industries, including very much cannabis and hemp. And I also am the host of Cannabis and Now. So it's a podcast from Civilized. Just got picked up for a second season, so give us a subscribe. But we are here discussing cannabis in the crosshairs. You know, I want to start by just kind of laying the groundwork. Where are we? What is the state of the union? Because, you know, we've already talked here today about cannabis journalism, the complexities that exist there with that medium. But so much of modern media at the same time really is social media. It's the App Store. It's how we interact with news so often through the lens of Twitter, Facebook, and that has really become such an important part of the national, international conversation. And here in cannabis, you know, it's red hot and necessary as well because of the complexities there and businesses' page getting banned or shadow banned or just straight up pulled. I have a dear friend who just lost their Instagram page, a great edibles company out of Colorado, and they're really starting from zero, and that is their primary driver of traffic. But, you know, if we're starting to talk about the state of the union, where are we right now in mid-2019 as it relates to this subject matter? Dustin, you want to get us started?
Sure. I think you hit the nail right on the head. Ultimately, all of us are up here talking about this issue because we're seeing cannabis businesses, you're seeing individuals who are cannabis consumers or patients having their social media profiles stripped from platforms or their apps compromised in terms of their integrity and utility to customers. There's a wide variety of applications, web pages that have all been censored for the most part, or in some places, as I mentioned, you lose total loss of functionality, compromising patients' ability to identify legal points of sale where they can absolutely obtain medical cannabis. So it's really kind of covering the whole groundwork in terms of how it's affecting cannabis businesses, cannabis industries, and cannabis consumers. It's a pervasive problem that there really isn't a lot of government address to at this point at the federal level, or even by the vast majority of these states who have organized these models. Even in California, we've got the Internet Association and the Tech Caucus, and you've got groups of lawmakers working with folks in the tech industry regularly because of Silicon Valley. There isn't a real appreciation for how those larger tech companies are kind of putting downward pressure and really kind of stifling the growth of the marketplace and stifling consumer access.
Anybody else have anything to add about, you know, kind of bringing us up to date, maybe personal experiences with what's happened and especially as this relates to social media, App Store, and this industry?
I could jump in. Yeah. One thing that is concerning to me, particularly about 2019, the landscape now, is how arbitrary the rules are. I mean, if I know what the rules are, then maybe I can work within a particular framework. But right now, it just seems random when pages are pulled, and that is what's, I think, frustrating for a lot of companies
Right.
that are doing business. Yeah.
Yeah, the popular, you've violated our terms of use.
Right. Without giving any kind of specifics, really, or it's general, but just there's no rules really. It's a lot of gray. And we find that a lot in the cannabis industry in general, but in particular, as far as social media is concerned, it's a lot of gray. And advertising too.
On a very basic foundational level, let's just kind of lay that quick groundwork. Maybe Mike, you can help us. Why do these businesses, these nonprofit organizations, these influencers, why do they need to be on social media? Why are these channels so essential for them?
Well, social media is important. We need to reach, for now this, our audience is millennials. So we need to reach those millennials, and that's where millennials live, is on social media and on their mobile phones. That's why social media is important. That everybody is on not just millennials, everybody is on their phones all the time. And, that's where this news that we put out needs to live, so that people can get that news and ingest that and take it and do whatever they want to with it, to advance cannabis laws.
Right. And Lada, can you speak to this too? Because we live in such a vastly different media environment today than even 10 years ago, than even 5 years ago. But why are these social channels so essential to a business, a media organization, a nonprofit organization?
Because social media is the way that we get the word out these days. If you don't exist on social media, I don't want to say that you don't exist, but it just makes everything a lot more difficult. And so it's interesting that because we're sort of reliant on those as like ways to communicate with people, it's important to keep in mind that different social media platforms, they all set their own community guidelines, their rules for what content you can put on it. And they also all have their own advertising guidelines that are even more stringent than their content guidelines. And it's tough because it's given that you're kind of playing by their rules when you're using their platform. As you've mentioned, you can easily lose everything that you've worked towards when they decide you're violating the community policy or the advertising guidelines. And all of these are, by the way, enforced by a combination of algorithms and humans. And so you aren't going to get consistent enforcement. You're going to get some things that get taken off for no reason. The guidelines would say that you can't depict the use of marijuana on Facebook. You can't have ads that sell it, although you can have ads for advocacy and education. But what people have found is that they, to give you an example, last year, there was a shadow ban of the California agency that officially regulates marijuana because you're working with an algorithm that was just banning anything with the word cannabis. So that's tricky, putting your faith in social media platforms, even though everyone kind of has to in today's world.
Yeah, that was a fascinating thing when it happened. I mean, that was a government agency whose Facebook page was pulled. Mm-hmm. And this is not limited to social channels. And of course, it's so much of our world, right? I don't know if any of you get that weekly reminder from your iPhone about how much time you spent on your phone on average per day, but I get that every Sunday and it's terrifying. But it's social media without a doubt, and they have this power because they have an ownership of what you're putting out there. But it's also the App Store. And not just Apple, it's Google, it's other channels. Dustin, I know that you guys face this regularly. I wrote a page one story for the Denver Post back in 2015, I believe, back when Weed Maps, Massroots, a lot of those early adopter apps were having problems pushing through updates. So can you talk about how this challenge also applies to beyond social media?
Of course, yeah. On the social media side, I think from a policy side, just to jump on that real quick, there's a lot of tools that you have compromised as well. If you're ultimately running campaigns and you're trying to sway voters and you're driving that message to their constituents at them trying to use social media platforms, doing Facebook ad buys, doing any kind of ad buys across those platforms, you're largely kept from the ability to do that by these platforms. But jumping into the information piece, I think now this said it dead on. We're talking about information delivery, really, ultimately through these platforms. And Weed Maps, I think you have the analogy of not only information that needs to be delivered out to our customers and to our clients that runs through our app. But you're also compromising delivery itself, of delivery of cannabis to patients, and that's something that I want to focus on a little bit. So in our app, we have a feature called WM Orders. Through the Orders platform, customers who are patients can place an order for pickup. There aren't enough retail access storefronts across America, folks. You've got 47 states with some form of legal access online, but very few of them have sufficient retail density to satisfy patient or consumer demand, meaning that the largest portion of the market will still remain illegal until electeds wake up to the fact that they need to create a larger legal market than there is an illegal market. In that environment, what you have for patients is an atmosphere where if I go to a dispensary to access cannabis for medicine, I have to wait in a long line most times. It can be a difficult thing to go to initially for a patient because of their physical health, and it can also be a problem once you get there. So pickup really is a savior for a lot of patients as they try to access the limited number of legal storefronts that exist in places like California. Now, through the App Store, we've had various components of that pickup mechanism that have been disabled. And Apple has offered all kinds of different rationale to that, but to the point raised by a number of folks across this panel, the rules set by Apple, whether they're advertising rules or whether they're rules related to content, there is no rule book, folks. And if there is a rule book, Apple's not showing it to us, and they're sure as heck not offering any kind of consistent interpretation of those rules. In that atmosphere, all of the work that we try to do to expand legal access, safe and legal access to patients is compromised. And it's not just our work. It's the work of cultivators, it's the work of manufacturers, it's the work of distributors, it's the work of testing labs, it's the work of retailers, it's the work of everybody across this industry that we're all trying to do together to build a functioning regulated marketplace. All of that is compromised by these technology platforms that seemingly are beyond government regulation at this point.
Lada, can you kind of walk us through this? Because there's issues of federal illegality, of course, but then we also can't help but think about censorship and free speech, you know? So what's happening in here? Is this happening primarily because it's still federally illegal, marijuana is?
Kind of. It's a really confusing legal landscape right now, as I'm sure everybody's aware. But I think the thing to keep in mind is that you've got policies about content and you've got policies about advertising, each platform does. And when it comes to content, usually if you're like discussing, say, the benefits of marijuana, that should be allowed. Most of the content rules would allow things like that, but and this is where it gets dicey, like you can't, for like say Facebook, you can't depict the usage of it, which is really strange, but you know, there's certain things where you are allowed to talk about it, you are allowed to advocate for it, or at least you're supposed to be. Like I said, the enforcement of this can be kind of off kilter. But with the advertising policies, each state has different advertising policies and each state has different legal standards for cannabis right now. And essentially Facebook and Google and the rest of them are sort of erring on the side of banning more stuff because they don't want to run afoul of anything. They don't want people doing anything that's illegal in a particular jurisdiction because they don't want to be regulated by the government. They're trying to avoid that. And so they're basically like, well, let's just ban it just in case. We don't really want somebody to say we're facilitating illegal activity. That's something that they're I'd say terrified of. And so that's why they're sort of leaning towards banning more advertisements or blocking more people from purchasing advertisements. And that kind of informs the rule book and everything that they do there.
Yeah, I remember early days, pre-adult use even, you know, certainly social media channels were a very popular way for dealers to sell product, you know, let people know where they're going to be, what it's going, you know, what the going rate might be. You know, we at Grasslands, we do run social media for a number of businesses, and we have a list of best practices. And I'll throw some of those things out there, and I'd love some feedback from the client or from the panel. But one of the things we tell clients is just don't talk about prices, don't talk about addresses. Let's keep these things, you know, if they want to find that, they can find that on Weed Maps. They can find that on your website, on your owned media. But for your Instagram channel, let's just not talk about those things because that generally is something that we've learned is something that gets the attention of those Instagram regulators that are paying close attention to you because they know exactly what you're doing. In part because of the hashtags you're using, in part because they just know even though there's millions of Instagram accounts. But I wonder if those kinds of best practices ring true with any of you, but also what your own best practices are. Kaylee, maybe you can share some of yours with us.
Sure. So early on, when we had our podcast and we first started, we definitely were a lot more loose in our social media presence. A big part of what Estro Haze is about is destigmatizing use, to be a platform where we can be out and proud as Black women and say we are cannabis consumers. It's fine. You can be a cannabis consumer too. We stepped out to do that. So that usage sometimes gets tagged, and a big part of that is showing our face, smoking or eating edibles or whatever. So we've had to get very creative in the way we tell stories. And that's kind of like our best practices. We don't promote selling of the product in any kind of way. We do talk about usage. We really only post certain things on our stories. We've been experimenting a lot, but we just had to get really creative in our storytelling and not be as explicit in it, I guess.
I'm sure. Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the more wiggle room you can leave yourself in those social channels is probably the better. But anybody else on the panel have anything to add there in terms of what you either practice or what you would recommend others practice?
Well, we don't necessarily make advertisements for Now This. We tell stories, and we give people the news, right? In a video format. To my knowledge, we haven't had any issues being pulled from Facebook or anything like that. Our only real issue is obviously the issue everybody else here has is placing ads and targeting on social media.
Sponsoring posts.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
And so you guys have not been able to do that.
It's hit and miss. There are some posts, the CBD explainer that we did with you actually had an ad on it. So there are some cannabis posts that'll have ads on them. No idea why. No idea why they say yes to one and no to another. It's up to Facebook really, which is confusing as hell for everyone.
Yeah, it takes me back to my editorial days. As we were starting the Cannabist, as we were reporting on the world's first implementation of adult use in Colorado, and certainly trying to sponsor posts, trying to target specific audiences of readers who we felt would care about this information. We are not plant touching, we are not license holding, we are not any of these things, and yet it was always a crapshoot. And we got turned down more than we got okayed. And that was really frustrating. I'm guessing you guys have played around in that pool as well, Kaylee.
Yeah, definitely. Some posts get approved, and slowly, none of our posts have been approved now. We haven't been banned from it necessarily, but lately they haven't approved any of the posts that we've submitted. So it's arbitrary again.
Yeah, we just made these, we made some fun handmade merch, some hand screen printed incense packets, packed them up. We gave them to some clients and prospects, but it was a wonderful process that we did with some of our creative partners and made a pretty thoughtful Instagram post about it, try to put some money behind it. Doesn't mention anything anywhere, cannabis, marijuana, hemp, and it definitely got turned down. I appealed 2 weeks ago. Got turned down, no explanation whatsoever. We're not a plant touching business. We work with other industries in addition to cannabis and hemp, including technology and traditional healthcare, and that is not still not working for us. Dustin Latta, can you maybe speak to why this doesn't only apply to license holders? It's also these ancillary businesses that happen to work with the industry as well.
I'm going to leave that one to you. I have no idea why that arbitrary method of application exists.
Because, you were saying that the rule book is not very clear to people and the guidelines aren't very clear. I think I don't think that there's necessarily like an internal rule book that says exactly what you should ban. That's the problem, right? The policy that says, don't promote something illegal or ban posts that actually refer to the sale of marijuana or might lead to that. That's really vague. And the two things that you have enforcing this vague policy are computers and people. And so they might just have seen that and been like, I don't know, just to err on the safe side, I'm just going to ban that post, you know? Or for all I know, a computer did that. And it's, although the visual recognition probably wouldn't have been good enough. It was probably a person, but, you know, you have that. And I think the reason why the rule book is vague, it's a bit intentional, because you'll see that with social media platforms and their policies about ads, about content, they change pretty frequently. It's kind of like every time there's a big public outcry about something, they'll shift it. You know, to give you an example, not cannabis related, Facebook had a policy saying that you could not post something that would depict child nudity, which is fair. And then there was that famous photo from the Vietnam War of the girl running from the napalm fire, and it does depict child nudity. So of course the Facebook algorithm or human moderator immediately took it down, and there was an outcry that this famous, very newsworthy photograph was removed. So now their policy about child nudity says something like, child nudity is banned unless it is related to a very significant journalistic moment. You get the idea. This really just ends up developing as it goes along. And so I think that is actually why the policy is vague, because they're not really sure what the outlines of it are either. It's very case by case.
I thought what you said earlier about these businesses themselves trying to avoid regulation was really poignant. You know, I think especially we saw Zuckerberg, what was that, last year, testifying? You know, and you can just tell he does not want them in his business, you know, because he just started this business in his dorm room, Senator. You know, how many times did we hear that? And he does not want those regulators in his business. And so there is probably this hypersensitivity to all of this. But one thing I've noticed, you know, and I've been paying close attention to this since 2013, is that there has been progress. Back then, it seemed like nobody was getting boosted posts through. Lots more pulled accounts. I guess shadow bans maybe have increased, but at least from my position, I've seen progress in these last 5-6 years on this subject matter. It's slight, it's still nebulous, and there's not a lot of guidance that they're giving us, but it seems like they're letting certain CBD companies boost posts. So I guess I'll put that question to the panel. Are you seeing progress, or have you seen progress in the last year and the last 5 years? Dustin, maybe starting with you, especially since Weed Maps is a giant in this space, and all of these channels are mammothly important to you guys.
For sure, we have not seen progress.
You have or no?
We have not.
You've not seen.
If anything, it's gotten worse, particularly as I think there are expansions to applications that have been developed for cannabis businesses. I'll give you another example. So not only do we conduct digital advertising through an online platform, but we also build and sell software to industry participants. One of those software programs is actually compliant delivery software. So that software, really, by facilitating safe and legal access through delivery, you're doing another solid for patients by giving them a way to receive cannabis without having to leave their homes. So it's a preferable model to storefront retail, or at least ought to be joined with storefront retail from a policy standpoint. But delivery fails to function appropriately for patients when they're unable to use it correctly, and the features associated with that on apps and platforms are ultimately dismantled or disabled. But the other challenge, I think, really is as you go about making some of these modifications to some of these tools and features that are really designed to facilitate broader patient access, those things are being compromised by this ever-changing series of policies. There seems to be greater reluctance, and perhaps that's exactly it. Maybe we're running up against sort of new policy for Apple, and they're trying to figure out, how do we balance this? And there's not enough public outcry about it for them to retreat into a position of having to establish some kind of functional policy for folks who are in the space. But we have not seen any real progress.
And so when you say you've not seen real progress, is that specifically on the App Store front, or does that also apply to how the social channels are treating your social platforms?
Oh, it's both.
Profiles?
It's both, absolutely. Like you say, it's not just Weed Maps. Obviously, it's the websites, it's the social media accounts of other folks on this panel, of other folks in this room who are involved either on the business side or the consumer side. I think everyone really has fallen subject to the same issues. I think where you've got a larger, perhaps more pervasive platform that might be monitored more heavily and more regularly.
You think?
So certainly we're a larger target, and we're going to experience more issues, and we're driving this directly and aggressively at these platforms as we build out and expand our scope.
Mike, I'm curious. I know you and I have talked a little bit about this. Now this has a number of channels. Now this weed, politics, her focuses on women's issues. Are your various Now This platforms treated differently by these social networks?
Aside from being able to boost posts and target posts, no, we're not treated any differently at all from the other channels.
And that's especially important for you because, granted, Now This has a website, but nobody watches Now This content on the website. Now This lives and breathes on social channels, so you guys depend on that access.
Yep.
Interesting. So the only difference is that Now This Weed cannot always sponsor posts. The other channels don't have that problem.
Correct. You know, the other channels actually help us get our content out there by cross posting and sharing. When a Now This Weed story about something that's going on with a politician is cross posted to the politics page, it blows up because the politics page has an incredible following that's very engaged, and that's engagement's everything on social media. No, we're not treated any differently than the other channels.
Well, I'd like to talk about this now too, because we keep mentioning that the rules are nebulous and they don't really open that up. And that doesn't matter if you are the holder of the account, if you're a journalist calling and asking them to explain why something is happening. I've had conversations with a lot of these networks and businesses that we're talking about. I've had multiple off-the-record conversations with Apple representatives. They refuse to talk about this on the record, at least with me. And then multiple off-the-record conversations with Facebook, Instagram, as well as Twitter. They talk generally about how this violates terms of use. But I'd love to hear what each of you have heard when you get turned down, when you appeal, whether it's an app or whether it's a social channel. But what are you hearing from these businesses specifically? And then what aren't you hearing that you wish you could hear? Kaylee?
I mean, I got those same kind of responses that we violated the terms of use. When I appeal it, it is kind of that same thing. You violated the terms of use. However, one thing that I find really interesting is that what I've asked is, can you give me the specifics of what I can and cannot do? And it's still vague, to speak to your point. So that's where I get frustrated. A lot of the time, particularly from boosting posts to when we've had a few posts being taken down, it's just really, what is it about, specifically about this post that violated your terms, your community terms? I need to know.
No guidance.
No guidance whatsoever.
I mean, Dustin, this falls directly in your purview, I'm guessing. And I'm guessing that you've had actual conversations with the people behind the messages. What are you hearing?
We have, and our experience is no different than either of yours. Whether it's regardless of the issue, it all comes, whether it's content or there's advertising policy, it's always the same explanation. You violated this particular section of that policy. When you seek further explanation of how you violated that and how you could preferably redress that, you're not really giving any clear guidance. Oftentimes you're set on kind of a fool's errand to pull together a bunch of data that you bring back to them and find out that by the time you bring it back to them, even if it's a week later, they've closed your case because they feel like you haven't gotten back to them in time. But they also haven't told you that there's some window that you have to get back to them by. So it's again, completely arbitrary. Whether I think this combination of humans and some kind of algorithm is really kind of failing this industry right now. There's got to be a better way.
Well, and this construct of federal illegality as well is just so immensely frustrating. And I wouldn't be surprised if that is at the core of every single panel up here today. I mean, that's really where so many of the headaches are born and where these frustrations come from. And here you have a substance that's legal in so many states, but illegal at that federal level. And perhaps some of this stems from that, perhaps it does not. But I guess I'm just curious, especially to not just sit up here and not give them the due that they deserve, but do these businesses, talking about Apple and Google, Facebook, Twitter, do they have a legitimate reason to say, you know what, your business is not welcome here? Do they have that legitimate reason right now, given the precariousness of where legality stands? Lada, could we start with you?
I think that their justification for it, or the reason behind it, is that they don't want the regulation that will come if people are engaging in illegal activity. And of course, the difficult thing is, when it's federally illegal, when it's illegal in some states and legal in other states, it's hard to say target your advertisement or your content to just one specific state. It's something, that's the thing about the internet, it's everywhere. So I think that what we've seen is Twitter, for instance, like their ad policies say you can't advertise the selling of cannabis, except you can do it if your ads are directed towards Canada because they legalized it. So I think that we'll definitely see something different if and when there's federal legalization. They're very cautious right now because this is such a strange legal atmosphere. I think that's something where they are trying to play it safe, and that'll be very different as more states legalize, and especially if there's federal legalization.
Is there something beyond that? I mean, these businesses not wanting to be regulated by the federal government is extremely meaningful. But beyond that, is there, some of these state versus federal clashes that we hear? It's like, oh, well, we could lose our federal funding or we could use our federal license. Is there something beyond that these businesses are also thinking about in the back of their mind?
I think they're also in the business of basically, they want you to spend as much time as possible using their platform. And so sometimes they will ban things because they think, well, this content might be offensive to somebody, or things like that. That's usually not their general policy, but you do see that happen. And I don't think it's so much about losing federal funding as it is they want to toe the line on this and sort of avoid that kind of scrutiny that can come when people use these platforms for illegal purposes.
Mm-hmm.
I think at the end of the day, it just comes down to it's their business, and the cannabis industry is evolving. It's evolving rapidly, and if Facebook doesn't want to let us put advertisements on our content now, they're going to eventually, and it's our job to continue pumping that content out and putting it in people's faces and changing the landscape of what this looks like, right? So if we just keep putting that content out, eventually they're going to have to change their minds about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully, that's the hope. But it's happening quickly. It's happening all across the country. And the more content we put out there, eventually Facebook's going to have to listen and say, hey, maybe we need to put ads on this stuff. We're putting ads on alcohol. We're putting ads on all this other stuff. Why not cannabis too?
Dustin, when you get turned down for an app update by Apple, is there a part of you that understands why they're acting with an overabundance of caution?
There's a part of me that wants to understand.
But no, in the meantime, you're just like, come on, what's your problem?
I think what's frustrating is, as a tech platform, as the company Weedmaps, we have to do quite a bit to ensure that we really do a lot of due diligence in satisfying regulatory compliance, whether it's at the federal level or state level. There's quite a bit that we have to do, not only with ourselves, but also in helping our clients and our customers. So we have pretty comprehensive application of regulatory compliance from our side. So I think what you really see with companies like Apple basically saying, oh yeah, we're just going to go ahead and wait until the federal government pulls its act together on broader policy reform and descheduling. So basically they're just kind of taking the lazy way out, as opposed to really going through and identifying what policy looks like across all the states that have organized some form of legal access and those that haven't, and really staying on top of the laws to ensure that the folks who are valuable members of their platform, we're all on their platforms the same as the rest of the consumers that are not in the cannabis space, have the same freedoms and accessibility through those platforms that everyone else does. So in our view, it's a bad policy that they've generated in the way they've conducted business in this way. And we would like to see an improvement.
it'll be interesting to see because it's inevitable, right? Federal legalization is going to happen someday. These businesses will start taking your advertisements, your boosted posts and sponsored posts someday, but will there be a facet of these industries, cannabis, hemp, and beyond, that remember these important days when we really needed them to be there for us, and they weren't? And so will we remember that? Do you guys think there's going to be a hangover that once they do allow it, we're going to remember that and maybe choose to spend our ad dollars elsewhere? Or do we need these channels so much that we're just going to need to rely on them regardless? Kaylee?
Well, I think it's our responsibility to also go where the people are, because a big part of what we do is educating people to destigmatize the plant and show them how it can be beneficial for their life in a variety of ways. So we are probably going to have to depend on those platforms if the people are there. I mean, that's just the reality of things.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Anybody have anything else to add there? It's just they hold all of the cards right in this situation, and we're completely at their mercy. You know, maybe we're running out of time, but I do want to get in one more question. How do we solve this? What are the best steps that we can use as media, as industry, as thought leaders, as consumers, and ultimately, so many of us are really consumers and customers of Facebook. You know, probably more than most other brands in our lives. But what are things that we can do to, you know, ideally be the change that we want to see in the world and lead to this eventual change we know is coming one of these days? Mike?
Just keep pumping the content out. Keep telling the stories. You know, cannabis is it's a hearts and minds campaign, and we need to change people's minds about what cannabis is and how much it helps people. You know, it's not just adult use. You know, there's medical cannabis, and it's an important thing. You know, my favorite stories to tell are people whose lives were saved by cannabis, because that mirrors my story, and I know how to tell that story. You know, we just keep pumping content out.
But when you talk about trying to change hearts and minds, are you trying to change Mark Zuckerberg's mind, or are you trying to change somebody's mind down the street here in the federal government, because that's where the change needs to happen for this conversation to move forward?
Mark Zuckerberg and politicians, everybody. We need to change everybody's mind. Everybody consumes social media, and that's why we need to keep putting that content on social media.
What about appealing directly to these channels? I mean, is it worth, you know, writing letters to these organizations and these businesses?
In some sense, because they're businesses, they do respond to public responses to things and public outrage or outcries. So that is one thing. I mean, the other thing, you know, what you said about once they do allow these advertising dollars to go into their industries, like, should they be forgiven and everything? I think I'm not anti-social media or anti these companies, but you know, they're just businesses, and no business is infallible, and no business is going to be around forever. So I think that, you know, it's important to remember that they're not evil, I don't think, but they're on their side. They're always going to be on their side. They'll take ad dollars from the industry when it becomes profitable and outweighs the risk of them doing so. So I almost think that maybe we shouldn't be so dependent on these pre-existing channels. I mean, part of the promise of the internet was that anybody could create anything. I don't think we need to be so limited sometimes.
Can I have a question?
Yeah,
I'm
please.
sorry. That was just an interesting point. How do we divert attention to our own platforms and not have to depend on? Because that's going to be the big how. You know, we shouldn't be dependent on these platforms, but how do you get the eyeballs off of them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, my wife, the minute, what was it that broke? Oh, Cambridge Analytica. The minute that news broke, she deleted her Facebook. And I was just like, you are so lucky, because my line of work would never allow me to do that. I can't do that, but I would have done it that day if I didn't rely on it. So that's a great question to the panel. What are the alternatives to supporting these multinational conglomerates that we've developed a certain amount of dependence on?
As you proposed that last question, I was listening to Kaylee respond to it. I was trying to think of where the hell you could go. But I thought you made a great point, Kaylee, that you really have to go where the people are. You have to go where your audience is, and generating some new place to go, I think, is certainly a laudable goal that really is incumbent upon all of us. In the meantime, I think we also all have to do our part to appeal directly to these platforms to improve. We have cases of patients who have shared with us correspondence that they've written directly to Apple saying, oh, you eliminated my ability to identify cannabis dispensaries where I live, and now I can't obtain legal access. Glaucoma patients and a series of other patients have sent us this correspondence. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us also to respond to Apple and to these platforms and let them know that this is a problem, this is unacceptable. As users of their platform, we demand more of them. And so I think it's going to be a little of both.
I'm curious, Dustin, has Weedmaps ever done a letter writing campaign? You guys have such an immediate through line to people who are passionate about these issues. I would imagine that could be relatively, and granted, I don't know that would be fruitful or successful, but I'm sure you guys could lead something like that. Has that ever happened?
It hasn't, but at the same time, while Weedmaps is a very large player in the cannabis space, we are not Apple. It is very much David taking on Goliath. So I think that kind of campaign is certainly compelling. We should talk more about what such a strategy might look like, but taking on that giant is a formidable task.
Yeah, and that makes sense, of course, because they hold the cards, and especially if you want future updates, which are many in the course of a year, I can see why you wouldn't want to necessarily take them head on.
The strategy to compromise this issue with Apple will be a delicate one.
Well, I think I think everybody in here, this is an issue that impacts us all. Whether you're looking for quality information or quality product, we all rely on these social channels so much. So regardless of an organized campaign or more by the people, I would absolutely recommend that each of you maybe reach out to the service of your choice and just say, hey, we think that you should be allowing more cannabis advertisements and not be so strict and absurdly discerning when it comes to the regulation of these businesses and their accounts and their social channels and their apps. But in the meantime, I want to thank my panel and thank all of you guys, and I hope it's a great rest of the day here at the National Cannabis Policy Summit. Thanks very much. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.